When a Boston socialite handed her platinum card to a broke stranger as a cruel joke, she expected designer shopping bags and champagne bottles, proof that poverty equals greed. Instead, $47,000 vanished in a single night, spent on something that shattered every assumption she'd ever made about worth, dignity, and what it means to be desperate. This is the story of Clara Wren's 24-hour game that backfired into a reckoning she never saw coming. And the single father who taught her that some people don't play games when their child's life hangs in the balance. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The ballroom of the Boston Harbor Hotel glittered like a jewelry box someone had shaken too hard. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across marble floors, and everywhere Clara Wren looked, she saw reflections of wealth so casual it had stopped registering as real. Women in gowns that cost what most people made in 6 months. Men in tuxedos discussing second homes in Nantucket like they were debating which sandwich to order. The charity gala, something about children's literacy, Clara thought, or maybe health initiatives, she honestly couldn't remember, was less about giving and more about being seen giving. Clara stood near the champagne fountain with her usual circle. Bethany Cross, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in Back Bay, and Morgan Wells, an investment banker who treated kindness like a stock that never paid dividends. They were laughing about something trivial, a boutique that had closed, a mutual friend's questionable Botox, when Claire's attention snagged on movement near the entrance. A man had just walked in, and he was all wrong. Not wrong in the dangerous way, wrong in the way that made the space around him seem to hold its breath. His suit was dark and probably borrowed, hanging just slightly loose at the shoulders in a way that suggested either rapid weight loss or someone else's closet. His shoes were clean but worn at the heels. His face was weathered in a way that spoke of too many nights with too little sleep, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. He looked like he'd aged in dog years. He was also clearly lost. "Oh God," Bethany murmured, following Clara's gaze. "Who let him in?" The man, mid-30s maybe, though it was hard to tell with that exhaustion stamped into his features, was standing just inside the ballroom entrance, scanning the crowd with the expression of someone who'd accidentally walked into the wrong movie theater. His hands hung at his sides, empty of the champagne flute that seemed to appear in everyone else's grip within seconds of arrival. "Probably came in with one of the volunteers," Morgan said, his tone flat with disinterest. "You know they let anyone help set up these things." But Clara watched as the man approached the donation table near the entrance, the elegant setup where guests were encouraged to make meaningful contributions with a suggested minimum of $100. She watched as he reached for his wallet with the kind of careful, deliberate movement that suggested he'd already counted what was inside at least twice before leaving home. She watched as the volunteer behind the table, an older woman in pearls and a fixed smile, said something quietly. Watched as the man's shoulders went rigid. Watched as he opened the wallet anyway, revealing what Clara could see even from 30 feet away was basically nothing. A few bills. Maybe $30, $40 total. The volunteer's smile never wavered, but her head shake was gentle and absolute. Not enough. The man stood there for just a moment, and Clara saw something in his face that she'd never really had to witness up close before. The specific mathematics of humiliation multiplied by exhaustion, multiplied by the bone-deep understanding that the world has already decided your worth before you open your mouth. Then he turned to leave. "Wait," Clara heard herself say. Bethany's hand touched her arm. "Clara, don't!" But Clara was already moving, champagne flute abandoned on a passing waiter's tray. She crossed the ballroom in that smooth glide that came from a childhood of cotillion classes and debutante balls. Her dress, a midnight blue thing that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, swishing against marble like a whisper. She reached the man just as he was about to push back through the entrance doors. "Excuse me." He turned, and up close Claire could see more details that told a story she'd never bothered to read before. The tiny scar above his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands that said manual labor, not golf clubs. The way his jaw was set like he was bracing for another blow. "Yeah?" His voice was rough, Boston accent bleeding through in the flat vowels. Clara pulled her platinum card from her clutch, the one with no limit because her family's trust fund was older than most of the buildings in this city. She held it out like a business card. "I saw what happened at the donation table," she said, and behind her she could feel Bethany and Morgan drifting closer, drawn by the scent of entertainment. "And I think there's been a misunderstanding about generosity tonight." The man looked at the card like it might bite him. "I don't need some—" "Here's what I'm thinking," Clara continued, her voice taking on that bright, sharp quality it got when she was performing for an audience. "It's clear you came here wanting to contribute, but the minimum is exclusionary. So let me make you a deal, a little game, if you will." She pressed the card into his hand before he could refuse. His fingers closed around it reflexively, and she saw him glance down at the platinum surface, at her full name embossed in raised letters, Clara Whitmore, Wren. 24 hours, Clara said. "You can spend whatever you want on this card. No limit, no restrictions. Consider it my contribution to," she waved vaguely, "whatever brings people to charity events they can't afford." Behind her, Bethany made a sound that was half laugh, half gasp. Morgan had pulled out his phone, probably already texting their group chat. The man stared at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, definitely not gratitude. Something darker, more complicated. Like he was doing calculations in his head that had nothing to do with money. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why not?" Clara shot back. "It's just money, and honestly—" She let herself smile, the same smile she'd been perfecting since prep school, the one that made everything a game and nothing quite real. "I'm curious what someone would do with complete financial freedom for a day. No judgment, no strings. Just, let's see what happens when the rules don't apply." Bethany was definitely filming now. Clara could see the phone angled in her peripheral vision. The man looked at this card again, then at Clara, then past her toward the ballroom full of people who'd never had to count the bills in their wallet before deciding if they could afford to be charitable. 24 hours, he repeated, his voice flat as pavement. "Starting now," Clara confirmed. "Do whatever you want, buy whatever you want. Live like money doesn't matter because for one day it doesn't." She expected something then, maybe gratitude, maybe excitement, maybe the kind of overwhelmed joy she sometimes saw on those reality shows where they surprised poor people with cash. Something that would confirm the narrative she was already constructing. She was being generous, he was being rescued, and tomorrow they'd all have a great story about how Clara Wren gave some random struggling guy the night of his life. Instead, the man pocketed the card with a movement so deliberate it looked almost violent. He met Clara's eyes dead on, and what she saw there made something small and cold settle in her chest. "Okay," he said. Then, "I'm Nate." "Clara," she replied, though he already knew that from the card. 24 hours, Nate said again. Not a question, a confirmation like he was accepting the terms of a contract. "And then?" "Then you bring it back," Clara said with a shrug, "and we'll see what the night taught us both." Nate nodded once, a short, sharp jerk of his chin. Then he turned and walked out of the ballroom without another word. Not toward the party, not toward the donation table, just straight out through the entrance doors and into the November cold. The doors swung shut behind him with a soft hush of expensive hinges, and Clara stood there for a moment, feeling Bethany and Morgan closing in like sharks scenting blood. "Oh my God," Bethany breathed. "Did you actually just—" "That was insane," Morgan cut in. "Clara, you realize he could just max that thing out, right? What's your limit on that card?" "There isn't one," Clara said absently, still staring at the doors. Something about the way Nate had walked out, not rushed, not excited, just purposeful and contained like he was carrying something fragile, had left a strange taste in her mouth. "Jesus Christ," Morgan said with a laugh. "Well, I give him 2 hours before we see charges from every luxury store on Newbury Street." "Definitely hitting the casinos," Bethany agreed. "Oh God, Clara, you have to promise you'll tell us everything when you see the statement." Clara smiled, but it felt mechanical. "Of course." They drifted back into the party, and Clara collected a fresh champagne flute, and the night continued in its predictable orbit of small talk and smaller concerns. But several times Clara found herself checking her phone. Not for the charges yet, it was too soon, just checking. Like she was waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, as the gala was winding down and people were collecting their coats and calling cars, Claire's phone finally buzzed with a notification from her bank's app. She opened it, expecting to see something from a restaurant or a bar. Maybe Nate had taken someone out for a nice dinner, or maybe he was drinking expensive whiskey somewhere and feeling temporarily rich. The notification loaded. Clara stared at the screen. Then she refreshed it, certain there had been some kind of error. The number didn't change. Transaction approved, $47,238. Boston Children's Hospital. Medical payment. What the fuck? Clara whispered. Nate Harper had stopped feeling the cold about 3 years ago, right around the time he'd learned that human bodies could survive on 4 hours of sleep if you taught yourself to dream while you were walking. He stood outside the Boston Harbor Hotel, platinum card burning a hole in his jacket pocket, and let the November wind cut through the borrowed suit like it was making a point. Behind him, the ballroom glowed like a spaceship that had landed in the wrong city. Ahead of him, across the street and down toward the waterfront, the real Boston sprawled out in all its messy, expensive, and different glory. 24 hours. Nate pulled out his phone, a 3-year-old model with a cracked screen protector, and checked the time. 8:47 p.m. Which meant he had until 8:47 p.m. tomorrow night to either change his life or confirm every assumption that woman had made about him. Clara. Clara Whitmore Wren, according to the card. He'd seen the way she smiled when she handed it over. Seen the way her friends had circled closer, phones out, ready for a show. Seen exactly what this was. A game. A rich girl's entertainment. Proof of concept that people like Nate, people who showed up to charity events in borrowed suits with empty wallets, were exactly what people like her suspected. Greedy, reckless, temporarily embarrassed millionaires who'd blow through cash the second someone gave them access. Nate had seen the trap, recognized it, and taken the card anyway. Because Mia needed medicine. Because the eviction notice was sitting on his kitchen table. Because pride was a luxury he'd stopped being able to afford around the same time he'd stopped feeling the cold. He walked. Not toward Newbury Street with its designer stores and its assumption that money equals shopping. Not toward any casino or bar or restaurant where he might perform the role Clara expected. He walked toward the Orange Line station, fishing his Charlie card from his wallet with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere around the third medical bill. The subway smelled like metal and old coffee and humanity pressed too close together. Nate found a seat between a nurse still in scrubs and a kid with headphones leaking tinny music. Nobody looked at him. Nobody cared about his borrowed suit or the platinum card in his pocket or the fact that for the next 24 hours he had access to more money than he'd ever imagined having. He rode the train toward Dorchester, toward the walk-up apartment building where the heat only worked sometimes and the landlord had stopped returning calls 2 months ago, toward Mia. The apartment was dark when Nate unlocked the door, which meant Mrs. Chen from 2B had already put Mia to bed. He could see light under his neighbor's door, heard the soft sound of a television playing some Korean drama. Mrs. Chen was 83 and had been watching Mia after school since Nate's shifts at the warehouse started running late. He paid her what he could, and she accepted it with the kind of dignity that came from understanding exactly how many different types of broke existed in the world. Nate knocked softly. Mrs. Chen opened the door, already wearing her nightgown, her face creasing into familiar concern when she saw him. "You look tired," she said, which was what she said every night because it was always true. "Long day," Nate agreed. "She okay? Sleeping good? Ate all her dinner? Did her breathing exercises?" Mrs. Chen's English was thickly accented but precise. She'd been a nurse in Seoul before immigrating 30 years ago, and she watched Mia's health with an attention that made Nate's chest tight with gratitude he could never adequately express. "Thank you," Nate said, handing her $40, the last cash from his wallet. "I know it's not—" Mrs. Chen waved him off. "You pay when you can. She's good girl. Easy to love." Nate felt his throat close up, which was happening more and more lately, this sudden ambush of emotion over simple kindness. He nodded because words felt impossible, and Mrs. Chen patted his arm and shuffled back into her apartment. Nate let himself into 3A. The apartment was exactly as he'd left it. Tiny, dim, held together with determination and desperation in roughly equal measure. Kitchen table buried under bills and medical statements. Couch with the broken spring that Nate had learned to avoid. Mia's backpack by the door, carefully organized because she was 8 years old and already knew that chaos had consequences. He moved quietly through the main room toward the bedroom, barely bigger than a closet, where Mia slept. She was curled on her side, small for 8, her breathing soft and even in the way that always made Nate stop and listen for several seconds just to be sure. Her dark hair was spread across the pillow in tangles that she'd let him braid tomorrow morning. Her nightlight, a cheap plastic thing shaped like a star, cast gentle shadows across her face. She looked peaceful. She looked healthy. She looked like every single thing that mattered in Nate's entire world. Nate stood in the doorway and watched her breathe and thought about the platinum card in his pocket and felt something that might have been rage or might have been grief or might have been the specific exhaustion that came from loving someone so much that your own life stopped mattering. Mia had been born with a congenital heart defect, something with ventricles and valves that Nate had learned to pronounce correctly only after the second surgery. Her mother, Sarah, had died during that surgery. Complications, they'd said. Rare, they'd said. "I'm so sorry," they'd said, and then they'd handed him a newborn with a fragile heart and a bill that would take 3 lifetimes to pay. That was 8 years ago. Since then, Nate had worked every job he could find that offered flexibility for a single father. Warehouse shifts, night security, a brief terrible stint in a call center that had him sobbing in his car during lunch breaks. None of them offered health insurance. All of them barely covered rent. Mia needed regular cardiology appointments at Boston Children's Hospital. She needed medications, 3 different prescriptions that kept her stable. She needed to avoid stress, avoid too much physical exertion, avoid anything that might trigger the arrhythmias that had already landed her in the emergency room twice this year. She needed her father to keep her alive. And Nate was failing. The medical debt had hit $180,000 last month. The hospital had been patient, more patient than he deserved, but patience had limits. They'd started talking about payment plans, about collections, about all the polite ways the system had of saying you're drowning and we're not throwing you a rope. The rent was 3 months behind. The eviction notice was dated for next week. The electricity bill had a cutoff warning. Mia's medications were running low, and the pharmacy wouldn't refill without payment. And tonight, some woman in a $10,000 dress had handed him a card with no limit and told him to have fun. Nate pulled out his phone and sat at the kitchen table, moving bills aside to make space. The platinum card gleamed under the single overhead light that still worked. He turned it over in his hands, reading Clara's name again, thinking about her smile and her friends' phones and the way she'd said it's just money, like that phrase meant the same thing to both of them. He opened his laptop, a machine so old it took 3 minutes to wake up from sleep mode, and logged into his bank account. His checking balance was $127.83. His savings account, which used to exist, no longer did. Then he opened a new browser tab and went to Boston Children's Hospital's payment portal. He'd been staring at the screen for months, looking at the outstanding balance that grew every time Mia needed care, looking at the minimum payment requirements that might as well have been asking for the moon. He pulled out the stack of bills from the table and started calculating. Medical debt, $180,000 in total, but the hospital would settle the most urgent portion, the stuff currently in collections, for $47,238. Back rent, $4,200 for 3 months plus late fees. Electric bill, $340, with a cutoff scheduled for next Monday. Gas bill, $210. Medications, $680, for a 3-month supply of all 3 prescriptions. Groceries, maybe $200 for basics that would last them through December. Nate sat there with a pen and paper, doing the math 3 times to make sure. His handwriting looked shaky even to himself. Total, $52,168. He had 24 hours and a card with no limit. He could save his daughter's life. Or he could do what Clara expected, blow it on stupid shit, confirm her assumptions, prove that poor people couldn't be trusted with money. Nate almost laughed, except nothing was funny. He thought about Sarah, who'd been a nurse before Mia was born, who'd believed in people even when they didn't deserve it. He thought about what she'd say if she could see him now, sitting in a crumbling apartment with a rich woman's credit card and a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. She'd tell him to save their daughter. She'd tell him pride was expensive. She'd tell him to take the gift and use it and deal with the consequences later. Nate opened the payment portal and entered Clara's card information. His hands were steady now. He processed the $47,238 payment to Boston Children's Hospital, watching the confirmation screen load with agonizing slowness. When it finally processed, he screenshotted it and saved it to his phone. One debt down. Then he paid the back rent through the landlord's portal, adding a note that said payment for September, October, November. Eviction notice rescinded per payment plan. He screenshotted that too. Electric bill? Gas bill. Both paid in full, both confirmed, both screenshotted. The pharmacy had an online system. He ordered Mia's medications, 3-month supply, delivery tomorrow. Screenshot. He looked at the time. 11:34 p.m. Then Nate did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He went to an online grocery service and ordered real food. Not ramen and canned soup. Actual food, fresh vegetables and fruit and the chicken breasts Mia loved. Bread that wasn't from the day-old rack. Milk that wasn't about to expire. He added peanut butter and jelly and the whole grain crackers Mia's cardiologist had recommended. He added juice boxes and string cheese and yogurt. He spent $340 on groceries and scheduled delivery for tomorrow morning. Screenshot. The laptop screen glowed in the dark apartment, and Nate sat there looking at the confirmation emails filling his inbox like evidence of something he couldn't quite name. Not theft. He'd been given permission. Not charity. There was nothing charitable about Clara's smile. Survival, maybe. The kind of mathematics you did when love outweighed pride and tomorrow mattered more than dignity. He checked the time again. 11:58 p.m. Then he opened a new document and started typing. Receipt of expenses. November 15th. He listed every transaction, every amount, every confirmation number. He noted the time and the purpose. He built a ledger that would show exactly where every dollar had gone, because whatever Clara thought this was, Nate was going to make sure she understood what it had actually been. Not a game. A lifeline. He worked until 2 a.m., organizing everything into a folder with printouts and screenshots and documentation that would have made an accountant weep with joy. Then he crawled into bed, not sleeping, just lying there in the dark, and thought about what came next. Because Clara had given him 24 hours, but she'd also given him something else. Proof that the world was exactly as broken as he'd always suspected, and that sometimes the only way to survive it was to take what you needed and refuse to apologize. Somewhere in the next room, Mia coughed softly in her sleep, then settled. Nate listened to her breathe and didn't sleep at all. Clara woke at 6 a.m. to 17 text messages, 4 missed calls, and a notification from her bank that made her sit straight up in bed. Alert. Multiple large transactions detected on account ending in 7392. She grabbed her phone with sleep-sticky hands and opened the banking app, her heart doing something arrhythmic that had nothing to do with champagne. The transactions loaded. $47,238, Boston Children's Hospital. $4,200, Property Management Solutions. $340, Atlantic Energy Services. $210, Boston Gas Company. $680, CVS Pharmacy. Online. $340, Fresh Direct Grocery Delivery. Clara stared at the screen. Then she scrolled up, thinking she'd somehow missed the charges from designer stores or restaurants or wherever people went when they wanted to pretend to be rich for a day. There was nothing else. The charges were all, every single one, utilities, medical, basic, survival. What the fuck, Clara said again, except this time it came out strangled. She called Bethany, who answered on the 4th ring, sounding hungover and annoyed. This better be good. He paid his medical bills, Clara said. The guy from last night, Nate. He used the card to pay medical bills and rent and... Bethany, what the fuck is happening? There was a long pause, then, what do you mean medical bills? Almost $50,000 to a children's hospital, and utilities, and Clara was scrolling again, checking the descriptions. Prescriptions. He bought groceries and prescriptions. That's it? Bethany sounded genuinely confused. He didn't buy anything? He bought survival, Clara said, and heard how hollow her voice sounded. He bought, Jesus, Bethany, he has a kid, a sick kid. And I handed him a card and told him to have fun like it was a fucking game. Okay, but Clara... Bethany was waking up now, her voice sharpening. You didn't know. How were you supposed to know? I could have asked, Clara said flatly. I could have asked literally anything about him instead of just assuming... Don't do this, Bethany cut in. Don't make this into some morality play. You were being generous. He took advantage. That's not your fault. But Clara was remembering the way Nate had looked at her last night. Not grateful, not excited, just evaluating, like he'd already run the numbers and knew exactly what this was, and had decided to take it anyway because the alternative was worse. I have to go, Clara said. Clara, wait. She hung up. For several minutes, she just sat there in her bedroom, the bedroom that was bigger than some people's entire apartments, with its custom closet and its ensuite bathroom and its view of the Charles River. Everything around her was expensive and beautiful and completely meaningless. Her phone buzzed again. Morgan this time, with a text. Bethany told me, call when you're ready to talk strategy. Strategy. Like this was a business deal gone wrong instead of a human being trying to keep his child alive. Clara got out of bed and paced to the window. The November sun was just starting to rise over the river, turning the water silver and gold. Down below, people were already moving, joggers on the esplanade, early commuters heading to the T, a woman walking a dog. Normal people doing normal things in a city that cost more than they could afford, but less than Clara had ever had to think about. She pulled up the transactions again and clicked on the hospital payment, looking for any additional information. The reference number led her to a patient portal, which required login credentials she didn't have. But the payment description included a name, Mia Harper. Clara opened a new browser window and typed before she could stop herself. Mia Harper, Boston Children's Hospital. The search results were mostly medical privacy walls, but she found something, a fundraising page from 2 years ago, long expired, with a photo of a little girl and a plea for help with surgical costs. Mia Harper, age 6, needs a second open heart surgery to repair complications from a congenital defect. Her mother passed away during her first surgery, and her father is struggling to cover the costs while caring for her alone. Clara clicked the photo, enlarging it. The little girl looked small for 6, with dark eyes and a shy smile. She was holding a stuffed bear, and someone, presumably Nate, had their hand on her shoulder just barely visible at the edge of the frame. The fundraising page had raised $3,400 of a $200,000 goal. Clara closed the laptop with slightly too much force. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and did something she hadn't done in years. She cried. Not the pretty, manageable tears that came during sad movies, the ugly kind that came from somewhere deep and unfamiliar, the kind that made her nose run and her throat close up. Because she'd looked at Nate last night and seen, what? A prop in her own story about generosity? Proof of her own open-mindedness? Entertainment for her friends? She'd seen everything except a father trying to keep his daughter alive. Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand and pulled herself together with the practiced efficiency that came from a lifetime of compartmentalizing inconvenient emotions. She showered, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of her usual designer armor, and made herself coffee she didn't drink. Then she checked her phone again. 24 hours meant Nate would return the card tonight around 8:47 p.m. Clara had roughly 11 hours to figure out what the hell she was supposed to say when he did. The day passed in strange, fractured pieces. Clara tried to work. She had a token job at her family's investment firm, the kind of position that was more about letterhead than labor, but couldn't focus. She answered emails without reading them. She attended a conference call without hearing it. She kept checking her phone, waiting for more charges, but nothing came. Just those same 6 transactions: medical, rent, utilities, medication, groceries. The bare minimum to survive. Around 3 p.m., she gave up pretending to work and drove. Not anywhere specific at first, just driving through Boston in her Range Rover. Another gift from her parents, Another thing she'd never had to save for, or sacrifice for, or even think about. She drove past Faneuil Hall and across the river into Cambridge, then looped back down through the South End. She ended up in Dorchester without quite meaning to. The neighborhood was quieter than the city center, more residential, the kind of place where triple-deckers lined the streets and people actually knew their neighbors' names. Clara parked and walked, feeling conspicuous in her expensive jacket and designer boots. She had no idea where Nate lived, no idea what she'd say if she found him, no idea what she was even doing here except that sitting in her apartment pretending this wasn't happening had become impossible. A small grocery store on the corner had a window display advertising check cashing services and EBT acceptance. Clara had never thought about what those signs meant, just background noise in neighborhoods she drove through without seeing. Now they felt like indictments. She bought a coffee at a bodega where the guy behind the counter looked at her like she'd wandered in from another planet. Maybe she had. Around 6 p.m., as the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping, Clara drove back to her apartment in the seaport. The building had a doorman and a gym and a rooftop terrace with heat lamps. Her apartment had heated floors and smart home integration and a refrigerator that cost more than 3 months of someone's rent. She sat on her couch and waited. The card was still out there. Still had 3 hours left before the game ended. Clara thought about calling Nate, but she didn't have his number. Thought about going to the hospital, but that felt invasive and creepy. Thought about just waiting until he returned the card and pretending this had all been fine. Actually, everyone had gotten what they wanted. Except she couldn't pretend anymore. At 8:30 p.m., her building's front desk called up. "Ms. Wren, there's a Nathan Harper here to see you." Clara's stomach dropped. "Send him up." She stood, suddenly unsure what to do with her hands, smoothed her hair, considered changing clothes, then realized how insane that was. She was standing in her living room trying to compose herself when the knock came. Clara opened the door. Nate stood in the hallway, still wearing the borrowed suit from last night, looking like he'd been awake for 36 hours straight. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear. His jaw was set in that same careful way, like he was holding something breakable. "Hi," Clara said, and her voice came out strange. 24 hours are up," Nate said. He held out the platinum card, and Clara saw that his hand wasn't shaking at all. "I'm returning it, as agreed." Clara took the card, and her fingers brushed his for just a second. His hands were cold. "Come in," she said. "Please." Nate hesitated, then stepped inside. He stood just inside the doorway, careful not to track anything onto her floor, and looked around her apartment with an expression Clara couldn't read. She saw him taking it in, the space, the view, the furniture that was carefully curated to look casual while costing a fortune. She saw him doing the same mathematics he'd probably been doing his whole life, calculating the distance between his world and hers. "Nice place," he said finally. "Nate," Clara started, then stopped because she had no idea what came next in this sentence. "I saw the charges." "I figured you would." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. "I documented everything, every transaction, every confirmation number. Here." He held out the folder, and Clara took it on autopilot. She opened it and saw the same compulsive organization she'd seen in the transaction list, printouts and screenshots and notes in handwriting that looked like it had been carved rather than written. "You didn't have to," Clara began. "Yeah, I did," Nate cut in, his voice flat. "You gave me a card and told me to spend whatever I wanted. I wanted to be clear about what I spent it on, so there's no confusion later about theft or fraud or whatever story you need to tell." Clara felt something twist in her chest. "I wasn't going to. Nate, I don't think you stole anything." "No?" He looked at her directly, and Clara saw that careful control starting to crack. "Because last night, you thought I'd spend it on shopping sprees and bottle service. You thought you'd get a good story about the poor guy who couldn't handle money. You handed me that card like I was a fucking social experiment." "You're right," Clara said, and watched surprise flicker across his face. "You're absolutely right. I made assumptions about you based on nothing except the fact that you couldn't afford the donation minimum. And I'm sorry." Nate stared at her. "You're sorry?" "Yes." "For what exactly?"
For being generous? For giving me money? His voice was getting harder, sharper.
Because from where I'm standing, you gave me exactly what I needed. You just thought it would play out different.
I thought it was a game, Clara said quietly. I thought it would be fun. It wasn't, Nate said. Then more quietly, wasn't fun at all. They stood there in her expensive entryway, and the silence stretched out between them like something physical. Finally, Clara said, "The little girl, Mia, that's your daughter." Nate's whole body went rigid. "How do you—" "The hospital payment had her name. I looked her up. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "No," Nate said. "You shouldn't have." "Is she okay?" For a long moment, Nate didn't answer. Then, "She's 8 years old and she has a congenital heart defect that required 2 surgeries before she was 6. Her mother died during the second surgery. The medical debt from all of that has been destroying us for years. I work 60-hour weeks at a warehouse, and we're still 3 months behind on rent. Her medications cost more than I make in a week. And yesterday—" His voice cracked slightly, and he stopped, visibly pulling himself together. "Yesterday, I showed up at your charity event with $40, thinking maybe I could donate something small, feel like a human being for 5 minutes. And instead, you handed me your credit card and made it into entertainment." Clara felt tears starting again, and she didn't try to hide them. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" Nate asked. "Or are you just uncomfortable because I didn't play my part correctly?" "Both, probably," Clara said honestly. "I'm sorry for assuming. I'm sorry for making assumptions. I'm sorry that you needed help and I turned it into a joke." Nate looked at her for a long time, and Clara couldn't tell what he was thinking. Then he said, very quietly, "My daughter needed medicine. We were going to be evicted next week. The hospital payment would have gone to collections and destroyed what's left of my credit. I took your card because pride is a luxury I can't afford anymore, not when Mia's life depends on me keeping our heads above water." He paused. "So I used it. I used every dollar I needed to keep us alive for another few months. And I came here to return it and give you documentation so you'd know exactly what kind of person I am. The kind who takes charity and uses it for survival instead of entertainment." "That doesn't make you—" "I know what it makes me," Nate interrupted. "It makes me someone who did what he had to do. I'm not proud of it. I'm not ashamed of it either. It just is." Clara looked down at the folder in her hands, at the careful documentation of a man trying to prove his worth through receipts. "Keep it," she said suddenly. Nate frowned. "What?" "The money, the charges. Keep it. Consider it—" She stopped, trying to find words that wouldn't sound condescending. "Consider it what it should have been from the start. Not a game, just help." "I don't want your charity," Nate said, his voice going hard again. "It's not charity," Clara said. "Or maybe it is, I don't know anymore. But Nate, your daughter needs medicine. You need to keep your apartment. Those aren't wants, they're needs. And I have more money than I'll ever use, sitting in accounts I never even check. So keep it, please." Nate stood there, jaw working like he was chewing through words that wouldn't come out right. "I don't need your pity," he said finally. "This isn't pity," Clara said. "This is me realizing that the world is broken in ways I've never had to see before. And maybe the only decent thing I can do is not make it worse." They looked at each other across the beautiful entryway of Clara's beautiful apartment, and Clara thought about all the distance between them that had nothing to do with square footage. Finally, Nate said, "I should go." "Wait," Clara started, but she didn't know what came next. Nate was already moving toward the door, and he paused with his hand on the handle and looked back. "Money isn't a measure of worth," he said quietly. "Choices are. You made yours last night, and I made mine. We both have to live with them." Then he opened the door and walked out, and Clara stood there holding a folder full of receipts that proved exactly what she'd been too blind to see, that sometimes people don't play games because their lives are already too hard to survive. The door clicked shut. Clara sank onto her couch and opened the folder again, reading through Nate's careful documentation. Every charge, every note, every proof that he'd taken what he needed and nothing more. At the very back of the folder, tucked behind the final receipt, was a photograph. Clara pulled it out.
It was the same image from the fundraising page, but printed on actual photo paper, the edges slightly worn like someone had been carrying it around for a while. Mia Harper, age 6 in the photo, but 8 now, holding her stuffed bear and smiling shyly at the camera. On the back, in Nate's carved handwriting, Mia's mother died during her second heart surgery, the same crisis that buried us under debt and grief. Your joke paid for 3 months of stability. I don't know if that was your intention, but that's what it did. Clara held the photograph and cried properly this time, the kind of crying that came from understanding how much of the world she'd never had to see and how little she'd done with everything she'd been given. Outside her window, Boston glittered with lights from 1,000 windows, each one holding stories she'd never know, struggles she'd never face, choices she'd never have to make. She sat there until the tears stopped, holding the photo of a little girl she'd never met whose life she'd accidentally helped save. And she thought about what came next. Clara didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, Mia's photograph on the nightstand where it caught the ambient light from the city outside. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Nate's face in her doorway, exhausted, guarded, holding that folder like evidence at a trial where he was both defendant and prosecutor. Money isn't a measure of worth. Choices are. By 6 a.m., Clara had made a decision. Not the kind of decision that felt good or noble or like the start of a redemption arc. Just a decision that felt necessary, the way breathing was necessary. She got up, showered, and dressed in the kind of clothes she used to wear before her life became a performance. Jeans, a plain sweater, boots that were practical rather than statement pieces. Then she made coffee, actually drank it this time, and opened her laptop. The folder Nate had left was still on her coffee table. Clara picked it up and went through it again, more carefully now, reading every notation and confirmation number, like she was studying for an exam. The medical payment had a patient account number. The rent payment listed an address in Dorchester. The pharmacy order showed a delivery confirmation for that same address. Clara opened Google Maps and typed in the address, 847 Talbot Avenue, Unit 3A. The street view showed a tired 3-story building with peeling paint and bars on the first-floor windows. Not dangerous looking, just worn down by decades of weather and deferred maintenance. The kind of building where landlords collected rent but didn't fix heat. Clara sat there looking at the screen, at this building where Nate and Mia lived their entire lives, in a space probably smaller than her bedroom. Then she picked up her phone and called someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Her father answered on the 3rd ring, his voice already impatient because it was barely 7 in the morning, and Marcus Wren didn't appreciate social calls during business hours, which for him started at 5 a.m. "Clara, what is it?" "I need information about a property," Clara said, skipping pleasantries because her father had never cared for them anyway. 847 Talbot Avenue in Dorchester. Who owns it? There was a pause. Why? Does it matter? It does if you're planning something impulsive. Her father's voice carried that familiar tone of mild disapproval he'd perfected over decades of watching Clara drift through life without purpose. What's this about? Clara closed her eyes. I met someone, a tenant in that building. I want to know who owns it and whether it's part of any portfolio we work with. We don't typically deal with properties in that price range, her father said, but she could hear him typing in the background. But let me check our databases. Hold on. Clara waited, listening to the sound of her father's keyboard and his occasional muttered commentary about outdated filing systems. Outside her window, the city was waking up. Traffic building on the streets below, lights clicking on in office buildings across the water. Property Management Solutions, her father said finally. They own several buildings in that area. Small operation, mostly focused on lower-income rentals. Not in our direct portfolio, but we've financed some of their acquisitions. Why? What's their reputation? Clara, what is this about? Dad, please. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, they're not great. High turnover, lots of complaints about maintenance, aggressive collection practices. They're not slumlords, but they're not winning any tenant advocacy awards either. Clara, thanks, Dad. I have to go. Clara, wait. She hung up before he could finish, then immediately pulled up Property Management Solutions on her laptop. Their website was bare bones and corporate, featuring stock photos of smiling families that definitely didn't live in buildings with bars on the windows. The contact page listed a main office in Quincy and a general inquiry email. Clara opened her email and started typing, then stopped. What was she doing? Writing an angry letter about tenant conditions, threatening to expose their practices, playing white savior to a man who'd made it clear he didn't want her pity? She deleted the draft and closed the laptop. The photograph of Mia stared at her from the nightstand. Clara picked up her phone again and called Bethany. "It's 7 in the morning," Bethany groaned. "What the hell, Clara?" "I need your help with something." "Does it involve coffee? Because I'm not functional without coffee." "Meet me at Thinking Cup in an hour," Clara said. "And Beth, don't bring Morgan." That got Bethany's attention. "Okay, now I'm worried. What's going on?" "Just meet me, please." Bethany agreed, probably more out of curiosity than friendship. And Clara spent the next hour pacing her apartment trying to figure out how to explain something she barely understood herself. The coffee shop was crowded with morning commuters when Clara arrived. Bethany was already there, looking polished in a cashmere coat and designer sunglasses despite the early hour. She'd claimed a corner table and was scrolling through her phone with the focused intensity of someone avoiding actual conversation. Clara slid into the seat across from her. "Thanks for coming." Bethany looked up and her expression shifted when she saw Clara's face. "Okay, you look terrible. What happened?" "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually listen instead of just waiting for your turn to talk." "That's unnecessarily harsh," Bethany said, but she put her phone face down on the table. "Fine, I'm listening." Clara took a breath. "The guy from the gala, Nate, he has an 8-year-old daughter with a heart condition. His wife died during the kid's surgery. He's been drowning in medical debt and working 60-hour weeks just to keep them housed and fed. When I gave him my card, he didn't go shopping or gambling or any of the things we assumed he would. He paid his medical bills. He paid his rent so they wouldn't get evicted. He bought groceries and medicine for his daughter." Bethany blinked. "Okay. That's it? Okay. What do you want me to say?" Bethany's voice was careful, like she was talking to someone having a breakdown. "That's sad. It's really sad. But Clara, you didn't know any of that when you gave him the card. You can't blame yourself for not being psychic." "I'm not blaming myself for not being psychic," Clara said, hearing her voice rise slightly. "I'm blaming myself for making assumptions, for treating another human being like entertainment, for living in a world where I can drop $50,000 on a whim and think it's funny, while people like Nate are choosing between their kids' medicine and rent." Bethany leaned back in her chair. "So what, you want to fix poverty now? Clara, one guy doesn't represent—" "He's not representing anything," Clara interrupted. "He's just a person who needed help, and I accidentally provided it while trying to prove a point about poor people being irresponsible with money. Do you not see how fucked up that is?" "I see that you're spiraling," Bethany said bluntly. "And I get it. This situation hit you in a weird way, and now you're processing some guilt about privilege or whatever. But Clara, you can't save everyone. And more importantly, you shouldn't try to save people who don't want to be saved." "He doesn't want pity," Clara said. "He made that very clear." "So what do you want from me?" Clara hadn't actually figured that part out yet. She'd called Bethany on instinct, looking for what? Permission? Validation? Someone to tell her she wasn't crazy for caring about this? "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I just needed to talk to someone who knows me and won't judge me for having feelings about this." Bethany's expression softened slightly. "I'm not judging you. I'm worried about you. This guy, Nate, he came into your life for one night, took the help you offered, and left. That's the end of the story. You don't owe him anything else, and he clearly doesn't want anything else from you." "I know that." "Do you?" Bethany leaned forward. "Because it sounds like you're about to do something impulsive and potentially creepy, like showing up at his apartment or trying to fix his entire life because you feel guilty about one thoughtless gesture." Clara opened her mouth to protest, then closed it because Bethany wasn't entirely wrong. "I just keep thinking about his daughter," Clara said quietly. "Mia, she's 8 years old and she has a heart condition, and she's depending on her father to keep her alive, and he's one missed paycheck away from losing everything. That's not hypothetical. That's their actual life." "And that's terrible," Bethany agreed. "But Clara, you already helped. You paid his bills. You gave him breathing room. That's more than most people would do.
Is it, though? Clara looked at her friend. Or is it just the bare minimum of human decency? Bethany sighed. I don't know how to answer that in a way that won't make me sound like an asshole. Try anyway. Fine. Bethany's voice went flat. Most people in our position wouldn't have noticed him at all. They wouldn't have given him the card, wouldn't have thought twice about some random guy at a charity event. You noticed, you engaged, you helped, even if your initial motivation was fucked up. That counts for something. Does it? Clara, I love you, but you're being kind of exhausting right now.
Bethany picked up her phone, then set it down again. Look, if you want my honest opinion, let this go. You did a good thing, even if you did it for complicated reasons. Take the win and move on. Clara stared at her coffee. I don't think I can. Why not? Because, Clara struggled to find words. Because I looked at that man and saw nothing. I saw a costume, a character, a convenient prop for my own story about how generous I am. And he saw me seeing that, and he took my money anyway because his daughter's life mattered more than his pride. That's not something I can just move on from. Bethany was quiet for a moment. Then, what are you going to do? I don't know yet. Well, when you figure it out, try not to make it weird. They finished their coffee in relative silence, and Clara left feeling more confused than when she'd arrived. Bethany meant well, she always meant well, but there was a fundamental disconnect in how they saw the world. For Bethany, Nate was a problem that had been solved. For Clara, he was a person who'd revealed how little she actually understood about the city she lived in. Clara drove without destination for a while, eventually finding herself back in Dorchester. She didn't go to Nate's building, that would have been crossing a line, but she drove through the neighborhood, really looking at it for the first time. The bodegas with signs in 3 languages, the churches that doubled as community centers, the families waiting at bus stops in the cold, the buildings that looked like they were held together by determination more than maintenance. This was Boston, too. Not the Boston she knew, with its waterfront condos and boutique coffee shops and rooftop bars. This was the Boston that existed in the margins of her awareness, populated by people she'd never bothered to see. Clara pulled over on a side street and just sat there. Engine running, heat on, watching people live their lives. A woman struggled past with 2 kids and a week's worth of groceries. A man in a work uniform trudged toward the tea station, shoulders hunched against the wind. A group of teenagers laughed on a corner, their breath visible in the cold air. Normal people doing normal things in a city that charged them more than they could afford for the privilege of survival. Clara's phone buzzed with a text from her father. We need to talk about this morning's call. Dinner tonight? She ignored it. Instead, she opened the Notes app on her phone and started writing. Not a plan exactly, but thoughts, fragments, questions. What does help actually look like? How do you help without condescension? Is there a way to use money that doesn't feel like charity? What would Nate actually need versus what I think he needs? She sat there for an hour, typing and deleting, trying to work through something that felt too big and too complicated for a simple solution. Finally, she drove back to her apartment and did something she'd been avoiding for years. She called her family's investment firm and asked to speak with someone in real estate acquisitions. The woman who answered, Jennifer, according to her email signature, sounded confused but professional. Ms. Wren, how can I help you? I want to know about affordable housing investments, Claire said. Specifically, properties in areas like Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, buildings that house working families. There was a pause. We typically don't focus on that market segment. The returns aren't... I'm not asking about returns, Clara interrupted. I'm asking about the properties themselves. Who owns them, how they're managed, whether there are opportunities to improve conditions without displacing tenants. Another pause. Longer this time. Ms. Wren, that's a fairly complex question. Would you like to schedule a meeting to discuss? Yes, Clara said, as soon as possible. Jennifer scheduled her for Thursday afternoon, and Clara hung up feeling like she'd started something without knowing where it would lead. The rest of Monday and all of Tuesday passed in a strange fog. Clara went through the motions of her normal life, responded to emails, attended a yoga class, had dinner with her mother, who spent 90 minutes talking about the upcoming holiday season without once asking Clara how she was doing. But everything felt muted, like she was watching her own life from a distance. On Wednesday morning, Clara did something she'd never done before. She called out sick from work and drove to Boston Children's Hospital. She didn't have a plan, didn't know what she was looking for, just knew that she needed to see it, the place where Nate's life had been broken open and never properly put back together. The hospital was enormous and bustling, full of parents with worried faces and children in wheelchairs and doctors moving with purposeful efficiency. Clara felt conspicuous and useless standing in the main lobby, so she found a cafe on the second floor and ordered coffee she didn't want. She sat by the window and watched families come and go. A mother holding a sleeping toddler. A father arguing quietly with someone on the phone about insurance coverage. Two grandparents who looked like they'd aged a decade overnight. These were Nate's people. Not in any literal sense, but in the sense that they all understood something Clara had never had to learn. That love sometimes meant watching your child suffer and being powerless to stop it. Clara finished her coffee and wandered through the public areas of the hospital, reading the plaques on the walls about donors and research initiatives and children who'd beaten impossible odds. The Wren family name appeared several times. Her grandfather had donated a wingback in the 80s, and her father's firm sponsored an annual fundraiser. Their money had built rooms where children like Mia received care. Their money had also created a system where fathers like Nate drowned in debt for accessing that care. The contradiction sat heavy in Clara's chest. She left the hospital and drove to her father's office in the financial district. She hadn't made an appointment, but the receptionist recognized her and waved her through to the executive floor where Marcus Wren kept a corner office with views of the harbor. Her father looked up from his computer with an expression of mild surprise. "Clara, I wasn't expecting you. I need to talk to you about something," Clara said, closing the door behind her. Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. "About the property you asked about Monday morning?" "About a lot of things." Clara sat down and realized she had no idea how to have this conversation. "Dad, what do you actually know about the buildings we finance? The apartments where real people live?" Her father leaned back in his chair, studying her with the analytical attention he usually reserved for quarterly reports. "We finance a diverse portfolio of properties. Residential, commercial, mixed use. We conduct thorough due diligence on—" "That's not what I'm asking," Clara interrupted. "I'm asking if you know what it's like to live in those buildings. If you've ever actually visited them, talked to the tenants, seen what conditions are like when landlords are more focused on profit than maintenance." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "That's not typically part of the investment analysis process." "Maybe it should be." "Clara," her father's voice was patient but firm, "I understand you're going through something right now. Your mother mentioned you seemed distracted at dinner. But running a successful investment firm requires focusing on financial metrics, not individual tenant stories." "What if those stories matter, though?" Clara leaned forward. "What if the reason we make money is because we're financing buildings where people live in conditions we'd never accept for ourselves?" "That's a considerable oversimplification." "Is it?" Clara felt her voice rising. "Because I met someone who lives in one of those buildings and he's working 60 hours a week and still can't afford to keep his kid healthy and housed. That's not theoretical. That's real." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "This is about the man from your charity event. Mom told you?" "Your mother tells me everything." He sighed. "Clara, I'm glad you helped someone in need. That's admirable. But you can't let one encounter reshape your entire worldview." "Why not?" "Because—" Her father stopped, seeming to search for words. "Because the world is more complicated than individual acts of kindness. The economic systems that create wealth and opportunity also create inequality. That's unfortunate, but it's not something you can fix by feeling guilty about privilege." "I'm not trying to fix anything," Clara said. "I'm trying to understand it." "To what end?" Clara didn't have an answer for that. She sat there in her father's expensive office, looking at the man who'd given her everything and taught her nothing about what any of it cost. "I have a meeting with Jennifer from Acquisitions tomorrow," Clara said finally. "About affordable housing investments." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Jennifer mentioned, "I'll be honest, Clara, I'm not sure what you're hoping to accomplish. Neither am I, Clara admitted, but I need to start somewhere. Her father regarded her with something that might have been concern or might have been calculation. With Marcus Wren, it was often hard to tell the difference. Your trust fund is yours to do with as you please, he said carefully. If you want to invest in lower margin properties out of some sense of social responsibility, that's your prerogative. Just understand that charity and business are different enterprises with different objectives. What if they don't have to be? Clara stood up. What if there's a way to make investments that actually help people instead of just extracting maximum profit? Then you'd be in the minority of investors, her father said. But you're an adult, Clara. Make your own decisions. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't disapproval either. Coming from Marcus Wren, it was practically a blessing. Clara left his office and went home, and for the first time in days, she felt like she had something resembling direction. Thursday's meeting with Jennifer turned out to be more productive than Clara expected. Jennifer had prepared a portfolio analysis of affordable housing properties in Boston, complete with ownership structures, tenant demographics, and financial performance metrics. Most of these buildings operate on thin margins, Jennifer explained, pulling up spreadsheets on her laptop. The rents are lower, maintenance costs are higher due to age and deferred upkeep, and tenant turnover creates collection challenges. From a pure investment perspective, they're not attractive. But people live there, Clara said. Yes, of course. Jennifer looked uncertain, like she wasn't sure where Clara was going with this. The question is what kind of investment model would allow for both profitability and improved tenant conditions. They spent 2 hours going through different scenarios. What if you acquired a building with the explicit goal of maintaining affordable rents while upgrading systems? What if you structured leases to include tenant protections against arbitrary eviction? What if you hired property managers who actually responded to maintenance requests? The numbers were complicated, but Jennifer seemed intrigued despite herself. It's an interesting thought experiment, she said, though I'm not sure our firm would support this kind of approach. I'm not asking the firm to support it, Clara said. I'm asking you to help me figure out if it's possible using my own money. Jennifer's expression shifted. You're serious about this? Yes. Can I ask why? Clara thought about Nate standing in her doorway, holding his folder of receipts like evidence. Thought about Mia's photograph and the fundraising page that had barely raised $3,000. Thought about all the buildings she'd never bothered to see and all the people whose lives she'd never bothered to consider. Because someone showed me what my money actually means, Clara said, and I can't unknow that anymore. Jennifer nodded slowly. All right, let me put together some models for you. But Ms. Wren, Clara, this isn't going to be simple. Affordable housing is complicated, and there are a lot of ways to get it wrong. I know, Clara said, but I have to try. She left the meeting with a stack of documents and a follow-up scheduled for next week. It wasn't a solution, wasn't even close to a solution, but it was something other than sitting in her apartment feeling helpless. That evening, Clara sat at her desk and pulled out Nate's folder again. She'd been avoiding the photograph, but now she looked at it directly. Mia Harper, small for her age, holding her stuffed bear and smiling despite everything. On impulse, Clara flipped the photo over and reread Nate's note. Your joke paid for 3 months of stability. I don't know if that was your intention, but that's what it did. 3 months. That was all the breathing room $50,000 had bought them. 3 months before the bills started piling up again, before the next crisis hit, before Nate had to choose between medicine and groceries. It wasn't enough. But maybe, Clara could build something that would be. She picked up her phone and called Jennifer. It's late, Jennifer answered, sounding bemused. I know, quick question. That building in Dorchester I asked my father about. 847 Talbot Avenue. Is it for sale? Let me check. Clara heard typing in the background. Not currently on the market, but the ownership company has been shopping several properties in that area. Why? Find out if they'd sell, Clara said. And Jennifer? I want to move fast on this. How fast? As fast as legally possible. There was a long pause. Then Jennifer said carefully, Clara, buying a building is not the same as helping one tenant. You understand that? I understand, Clara said, but I'm not trying to help one tenant. I'm trying to figure out if it's possible to own property without being a predator. Jennifer stopped. That's actually a really interesting question.
So you'll help? Yeah, Jennifer said, and she sounded almost excited. Yeah, I'll help. Give me a few days to make some calls. Clara hung up and sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, looking out at the city lights and thinking about Nate and Mia in their crumbling walk-up 3 miles away. She didn't know if what she was planning would help or hurt or just complicate an already complicated situation, but she knew she couldn't sit still anymore. Somewhere in Dorchester, Nate was probably putting Mia to bed, checking her breathing, calculating how many more shifts he needed to work before the next crisis hit.
And Clara was going to make sure that when it did, he had more than 3 months of breathing room to face it. Jennifer called back 3 days later with news that made Clara's stomach drop and her heart race in equal measure. They'll sell, Jennifer said without preamble. Property Management Solutions is consolidating their portfolio, and 847 Talbot is on their list. They're asking $2.3 million. Clara was sitting in her apartment, laptop open to financial spreadsheets she barely understood, trying to teach herself the economics of building ownership. That seems low for a 3-story building in Boston. It's Dorchester, not Back Bay, and the building needs significant work, new heating system, updated electrical, probably full plumbing overhaul. They've deferred maintenance for years. Jennifer paused. Clara, are you sure about this? Because once we start the acquisition process, it's going to move fast, and you'll be responsible for 18 units and all the headaches that come with them. I'm sure, Clara said, though she wasn't sure at all. She was terrified. But terror felt better than the hollow uselessness that had been eating at her for days. All right, I'll draft a letter of intent. But Clara, we need to talk about management structure. You can't just buy a building and hope it runs itself. They spent the next hour on the phone, Jennifer walking Clara through the realities of property ownership. You needed a management company, or at least a superintendent. You needed contracts with maintenance vendors and plumbers and electricians. You needed a plan for rent collection, for lease renewals, for what happened when tenants couldn't pay or when emergencies struck at 3 a.m. What about the current tenants? Clara asked. What happens to them during the sale? Their leases transfer with the property. You'd inherit them as is, though you could choose not to renew when terms expire. I don't want anyone displaced, Clara said firmly. That's non-negotiable. Even if some are behind on rent? Clara thought about Nate's 3 months of back rent that her card had covered, especially if they're behind on rent. Jennifer, the whole point of this is to create stable housing, not to extract maximum profit. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. You know this is going to cost you money, right? Like, actually lose money, not just make less money than optimal. I have money to lose, Clara said. What I don't have is a clear conscience about how I've been living. Okay. Jennifer's voice shifted into business mode. Let me work up some projections. But Clara, you should visit the building before you commit. See what you're actually buying. Can you arrange that? I'll set something up for tomorrow. After they hung up, Clara sat very still in her apartment, processing what she'd just set in motion. She was about to spend $2, $3 million of her trust fund on a building she'd never seen inside, in a neighborhood she'd driven through exactly twice, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate to anyone, including herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Bethany. Lunch tomorrow? Clara typed back. Can't. Building inspection in Dorchester. The response came immediately. What building? Clara didn't answer. She wasn't ready to explain this to Bethany, wasn't ready to defend her choices to someone who'd already decided Clara was having some kind of crisis. Maybe she was. But if so, it was the most purposeful crisis she'd ever had. The next morning, Clara met Jennifer outside 847 Talbot Avenue. In daylight, the building looked even more worn than it had in Google Street View. The brick facade was grimy with decades of city pollution. Several windows had cracks spiderwebbing across the glass. The front steps were uneven, and someone had tried to patch them with concrete that didn't match. Jennifer was waiting with a man in his 50s wearing a Property Management Solutions polo and an expression of extreme disinterest. Ms. Wren, this is Rick from PMS. He's going to walk us through the property. Rick grunted something that might have been a greeting and unlocked the front door. Building's got 3 floors, 6 units per floor. Current occupancy is 16 of 18. Heating's oil. Electrical's been updated in the last decade, but not to current code. Plumbing's original from 1952. They stepped into a hallway that smelled like old cooking and mildew. The overhead light flickered, and Clara could hear someone's television through a nearby door. "We'll start with the vacant units," Rick said, leading them upstairs that creaked ominously. "Easier than bothering tenants." The first vacant unit was on the second floor. Rick unlocked it and stepped aside, and Clara walked into a space that made her chest tighten with something between anger and shame. The apartment was small, maybe 650 square feet, with a kitchen, a bathroom, and 2 small bedrooms. The linoleum flooring was cracked and peeling. The kitchen cabinets hung crooked on their hinges. The bathroom had visible mold creeping up the walls around the tub. The windows were single pane and let in drafts even with them closed. "This rent's for $1,400 a month?" Clara asked. $1,350, Rick corrected. "Below market for the area." "It's uninhabitable," Clara said flatly. Rick shrugged. "It's vacant. Gets rented within a week every time it opens up." Because people were desperate, Clara thought. Because $1,350 for a moldy apartment with broken cabinets was still cheaper than anything else they could find in a city that had decided housing was a luxury good. Jennifer was taking notes on her phone, photographing the worst damage. "The other vacant unit similar?" "Worse," Rick said. "Ceiling leak that hasn't been fixed yet." They toured it anyway, and Rick was right. It was worse. The ceiling in the smaller bedroom had a brown water stain the size of a dinner table, and when Clara looked up, she could see where the plaster had started to sag. "How long has this been leaking?" Jennifer asked. "Couple months. We're getting quotes for repairs." "You're getting quotes," Clara repeated, her voice dangerously flat. "The ceiling is about to collapse, and you're still getting quotes." Rick's disinterest finally cracked into defensiveness. "Look, lady, we manage 40 buildings. We prioritize based on severity, and a ceiling about to fall on someone isn't severe?" "No one's living here," Rick shot back. "That's why it's vacant. We pulled the tenant out when the leak started." "And put them where?" Rick shrugged. "Not my department." Clara looked at Jennifer, who was very carefully keeping her expression neutral. "Can we see occupied units?" "We'd need to give notice." "I own this building as of tomorrow," Clara interrupted, which wasn't technically true but felt true enough. "I want to see what conditions my tenants are living in." Rick made a call, had a terse conversation with someone, then led them to the 3rd floor. He knocked on 3A, and Clara's heart stopped when she realized what unit this was. Nate's apartment. The door opened and an elderly Korean woman stood there, regarding them with polite suspicion. "Yes?" "Mrs. Chen, sorry to bother you," Rick said in a tone that suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "New potential owner wants to see some units. Can we look at 3A? Mrs. Chen's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Harper is at work. I watch the baby." "We don't need to go in 3A, Clara said quickly. "We can see other units." But Mrs. Chen was already opening her own door wider. "You want to see what building is like? See mine. I live here 30 years. They stepped into an apartment that was almost identical in layout to the vacant ones, but transformed by decades of careful living. The floors were covered in clean rugs. The kitchen was spotless despite the old appliances. Plants lined the windowsills, and photographs covered every available wall surface. It was also freezing cold. "Heat doesn't work again," Mrs. Chen said matter-of-factly. "I call 4 times. They say they come fix. No one comes." Clara looked at Rick, who suddenly found the ceiling very interesting. "How long has the heat been out?" Jennifer asked, still taking notes. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Mrs. Chen wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. "I use space heater, but expensive. Electric bill very high." "You shouldn't have to use a space heater in November," Clara said. "This is... Rick, why hasn't this been fixed?" "I'll have to check the work orders." "Don't bother," Clara cut him off. She turned to Mrs. Chen. "Ma'am, I'm very sorry about this. The heat will be fixed within 24 hours, and your next month's rent is waived to compensate for the inconvenience." Rick started to protest, but Jennifer shot him a look that could have frozen water. Mrs. Chen studied Clara with sharp eyes. "You new owner?" "I'm going to be," Clara said, "and things are going to change around here." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. Good. Building used to be good. Now is, she gestured vaguely at the cold apartment. Not so good. They left after Clara got Mrs. Chen's phone number and promised again about the heat. Rick was silent and hostile on the way back down, clearly calculating how to report this interaction to his supervisors. Outside, Jennifer waited until Rick had driven away before turning to Clara. Well, that was something. That was unacceptable, Clara said. Her hands were shaking with anger. Jennifer, these are the conditions we're financing? People living without heat in November? Ceilings collapsing? This is what our money supports? Our money finances acquisitions, Jennifer said carefully. Property management is the owner's responsibility. So we profit while claiming no responsibility for how tenants are treated? Jennifer stopped. Yeah, that's basically how it works. Clara looked up at the building, at the windows where 18 families lived their lives in spaces she'd never considered before. Somewhere behind one of those windows, Nate was probably at work, trusting that Mrs. Chen was keeping Mia warm and safe in an apartment that currently had no heat. Make the offer, Clara said. Full asking price, close as fast as legally possible. And Jennifer, find me a property manager who actually gives a shit about people. That might be harder than you think. Try anyway. The purchase moved forward with the kind of speed that only happened when you had money and lawyers who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Clara's father called twice to express concerns about the investment, but he didn't try to stop her. Her mother sent a worried email about Clara's recent behavior that Clara deleted without responding. Bethany stopped asking questions after Clara gave her a look that promised future explanation, but not current discussion. 5 days after the building inspection, Clara sat in a lawyer's office signing documents that transferred ownership of 847 Talbot Avenue to a newly formed LLC she'd named Stable Ground Holdings. The name had come to her at 3 a.m. during one of the many sleepless nights she'd been having because that's what she wanted to provide. Stable ground, the kind Nate had been fighting for his entire adult life. Congratulations, the lawyer said when the last signature was complete. You're now a landlord. Clara looked at the deed, at her name on the ownership documents, and felt the weight of 18 families settling onto her shoulders. What's next? She asked Jennifer, who'd been present for the entire closing. We need to address immediate issues. The heating system is my biggest concern. It's barely functional and winter's coming. Then the electrical needs upgrading, plumbing inspection, roof evaluation. Jennifer had prepared a comprehensive list. And we need to notify tenants about the ownership change. Do we have to? Legally, yes. New owner, new lease terms potentially, new management structure. You can't just secretly buy the building where someone lives. Clara thought about Nate, about his careful documentation and his refusal of pity, about how he'd react to learning that the woman who'd turned him into a social experiment now owned his home. He's going to be furious, Clara said quietly. Jennifer looked confused. Who? One of the tenants, Unit 3A. Clara stopped, not sure how to explain. We have a complicated history. Complicated how? I'll tell you later. How soon do we need to send the notification? Within 30 days of closing, but Clara, the sooner the better. Rumors spread in buildings like this, and you want people to hear the truth from you, not secondhand speculation. Clara nodded, already dreading the conversation she knew was coming. Okay, draft something and send it to me for approval. The notification letter Jennifer prepared was professional and reassuring, explaining the ownership change and promising that all existing leases would be honored, no rent increases were planned, and building improvements would begin immediately. Clara read it 3 times, made minor edits, and finally approved it for distribution. The letters went out on a Tuesday. Wednesday afternoon, Clara's phone rang from an unknown number. She answered without thinking. Hello? What the fuck are you doing? Nate's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. Clara's stomach dropped. Nate, I got a letter today saying my building has a new owner, Stable Ground Holdings, LLC. Took me about 10 minutes of Googling to figure out that's you. His breathing was harsh over the phone. So I'll ask again, what the fuck are you doing? Can we talk in person? Clara asked. No, we can talk right now. Did you buy my building? Clara closed her eyes. Yes. The silence that followed was worse than yelling. Why? Nate finally asked, and his voice was so flat it scared her. Because the heat was broken and the ceilings were collapsing and people were living in conditions no one should have to accept. People including me. Yes. So what? Nate's voice cracked slightly. You felt bad about your charity experiment and decided to buy an entire building? You thought that would make us even? That's not what this is, Clara said, but she could hear how weak it sounded. Then what is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've gone from treating me like entertainment to treating me like a project. And I don't know which is worse. Nate, please. I used your money because Mia needed medicine. Nate cut her off. I took your card and I spent what I had to, and I documented every cent because I knew you'd judge me for it. But I didn't ask you to follow me home. I didn't ask you to fix my life. I didn't ask you to become my fucking landlord. I know that, Clara said quietly. Do you? Nate's laugh was bitter. Because it seems like you think money gives you the right to just insert yourself into people's lives whenever you feel guilty about privilege. That's not... Clara stopped because maybe it was exactly that. I'm trying to help. I don't want your help, Nate said. I want to live my life without being someone's redemption arc. You're not? Yes, I am. You met me at your charity event and I became your moral awakening, or whatever rich people call it, when they suddenly notice poor people exist. And now you've bought the building where I live, like that's a solution to anything. Clara felt tears starting and forced them back. The building needed better management. People were living without heat. That's not about you. But I live there, Nate said. And now every month when I pay rent, I'm paying you. Do you not see how fucked up that is? I can... Clara struggled for words. If you want to move, I can help. I can't afford to move. Nate's control finally shattered. Do you not get that? I'm still buried in debt. I'm still working 60-hour weeks. Your $50,000 bought me 3 months of breathing room, and now it's almost gone and we're back where we started. I can't afford security deposits or moving trucks or time off work to apartment hunt. I'm stuck here. And now you own here. Clara sat down heavily on her couch, phone pressed to her ear, listening to Nate breathe harsh and angry on the other end. I'm sorry, she said finally. You're right. I didn't think about how this would feel from your perspective. I saw the building conditions and I couldn't stop thinking about you and Mia living there, and I thought if I owned it, I could make things better. Make things better for who? Nate asked. Because it doesn't make things better for me. It just makes things more complicated. What do you want me to do? I want you to leave me alone, Nate said. I want to pay my rent to some faceless company and go to work and take care of my daughter without feeling like I'm part of someone's personal growth journey. Okay, Clara said, though the word felt like broken glass. I'll have Jennifer set up the management so you never have to interact with me directly. Jennifer? My real estate advisor. She's helping me hire property managers who will actually fix things when they break. Nate was quiet for a long moment. You're really going to fix the building? Yes, new heating system, electrical upgrades, plumbing repairs, everything that's been deferred for years. And rent stays the same? Rent stays the same, Clara confirmed. That's in the letter. No increases, all existing leases honored, improvements at no cost to tenants. Another silence, longer this time. I don't know what to do with this, Nate said finally, his voice tired now instead of angry. I don't know how to feel about you owning the place where my daughter sleeps. You don't have to feel anything about it, Clara said. You can just exist, pay rent, call for maintenance when needed, live your life. You don't owe me gratitude or acknowledgement or anything else. That's not how the world works, Nate said. Someone owns something, they have power over it. You own my building. You have power over my housing. That's not neutral. He was right, and Clara didn't know how to fix it. I'm sorry, she said again. I know that doesn't change anything, but I am. Yeah, Nate said quietly. Me too. He hung up. Clara sat there holding her phone, feeling the full weight of what she'd done settling into her bones. She thought buying the building was helping. She thought she was creating stability, fixing a broken system, using her money for good. She hadn't thought about what it would feel like for Nate to have his landlord be the woman who'd humiliated him at a charity gala. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Heating contractor starts tomorrow. Electrical assessment scheduled for next week. You okay? Clara typed back, no, but do it anyway. The work on the building started the next day and immediately revealed that conditions were even worse than the initial inspection had suggested. The heating system was 40 years old and had been patched together with the mechanical equivalent of duct tape and prayer. The electrical panel was a fire hazard. The plumbing had leaks in walls that had been hidden by cheap cosmetic repairs. Jennifer sent Clara daily updates with photographs and cost estimates that made her trust fund balance drop with alarming speed. But Clara approved every repair, every upgrade, every expense. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it right. The tenants' reactions to the new ownership varied. Some were cautiously optimistic. Others were suspicious, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Mrs. Chen called Clara directly to thank her for fixing the heat within 48 hours as promised, which made Clara cry in her office bathroom for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Nate didn't call again. Clara hired a property management company that Jennifer had vetted carefully, a small firm run by a woman named Patricia, who'd been a tenant organizer before going into management. Patricia understood the balance between financial viability and human decency in a way that felt revolutionary. I'm not going to pretend this will be easy, Patricia told Clara during their first meeting. You're trying to provide affordable housing while maintaining a building to decent standards. Those two things are usually in tension. I know, Clara said, but it has to be possible. Possible, yes. Profitable, not so much. Patricia pulled up her preliminary budget analysis. Based on current rents and projected expenses, you're going to operate at a loss for at least the first 2 years, probably longer. How much of a loss? Conservatively? $180,000 to $200,000 annually. Clara absorbed that number. It was less than she'd spent on her car, less than she'd dropped on art she didn't look at, or furniture she didn't use. But it was also real money that would come from her trust fund every year to subsidize housing for 18 families she didn't know, except she did know one of them. That's acceptable, Clara said. Patricia studied her. You're serious about this? Yes. Then we can make it work. But Clara, you need to understand you're not going to get recognition for this. Tenants aren't going to thank you. They're going to complain about maintenance and ask for accommodations and generally treat you like a landlord because that's what you are. I don't want recognition, Clara said. I just want people to have heat in November. Patricia smiled slightly. All right then, let's build something that doesn't suck. Over the next 3 weeks, the building transformed in ways that were both visible and invisible. The new heating system went in, and Clara got her first appreciative calls from tenants who couldn't believe their apartments were actually warm. The electrical upgrades happened in stages, requiring some units to temporarily relocate to hotels that Clara paid for. The worst plumbing issues got addressed, though the full overhaul would take months. Patricia hired a superintendent who lived in building, a retired plumber named Marcus who took genuine pride in keeping things functional. She set up a system for maintenance requests that actually got responses. She established office hours where tenants could come ask questions or raise concerns. Clara stayed out of it, managing everything remotely through Jennifer and Patricia, honoring Nate's request to leave him alone. But she couldn't stop thinking about him, about Mia, who was somewhere in that building doing homework and breathing easier because the apartment was finally warm, about how 3 months had probably passed by now, which meant Nate was back to calculating impossible mathematics between medicine and groceries, about how she'd tried to help and maybe just made everything worse. 3 weeks after the ownership transfer, Clara was working late in her apartment when her phone rang. Unknown number again, but this time she recognized it. She answered carefully. Hello? It's Nate. His voice was neutral, unreadable. You got a minute? Yes, of course. The heat works, he said. Mrs. Chen's apartment is warm for the first time in years. They fixed the leak in 2B. They replaced the broken stove in 1C. The hallway lights all work now. Clara waited, unsure where this was going. I called to say thank you, Nate continued, and the words sounded like they cost him something. I'm still angry about how this happened. I'm still uncomfortable with you owning my building, but I'd be lying if I said things weren't better. You don't have to thank me, Clara said quietly. Yeah, I do, because... Nate paused.
Because Mia came home from school yesterday and said her room was cozy for the first time ever. She didn't have to sleep in her jacket, and that matters, even if I hate how we got here. Clara felt her throat close up. How is she? She's good. Another pause. She's stable. The medications are working. She has a cardiology appointment next month, and we're not behind on bills for the first time in years. That's good, Clara managed. Is it, though? Nate's voice sharpened slightly. Because I'm still thinking about what happens in 3 months, 6 months, a year. Your card bought me breathing room, but breathing room runs out. What if it didn't have to? The words came out before Clara could stop them. What does that mean? Clara took a breath, knowing she was about to cross another line, but unable to stop herself. What if there was a job, something stable with actual health insurance and flexibility for a single parent? Clara, just listen, please. Clara stood up, pacing her apartment. My family's investment firm needs someone who understands real estate from the tenant perspective, someone who can evaluate properties not just for financial metrics, but for whether they're actually livable, someone who can tell us when we're financing buildings that treat people like I was treated, Nate finished. Yes, exactly like that. Nate laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. You want to hire me. I want to offer you an opportunity, Clara corrected. A real job with real salary and benefits. Something that uses your perspective and your experience instead of just asking you to be grateful for charity. I don't have qualifications for... You have better qualifications than anyone else I could hire, Clara interrupted. You've lived this. You know what it's like to choose between rent and medicine. You know what broken promises from landlords cost. You know... Her voice caught. You know what it means when systems fail people. The silence on the other end stretched so long Clara thought he'd hung up. Finally, what's the catch? No catch. Market salary for a consultant position, full family health coverage, flexible hours so you can take care of Mia. You'd work with Jennifer evaluating properties and advising on tenant-focused improvements. And I'd be working for you. You'd be working with me, Clara said. But Nate, if this makes you uncomfortable, if it feels like pity or charity or another way for me to insert myself into your life, it does, Nate cut in. It feels like all of those things. Clara's heart sank. Okay, I understand, but it also feels like a way out, Nate continued quietly. Like maybe for the first time in 8 years, I could stop drowning long enough to actually breathe. So yeah, I'm uncomfortable, but I'd be stupid to say no. You're not stupid if you say no, Clara said. You're allowed to have boundaries. Boundaries are expensive, Nate said, echoing what he'd told her before about pride. And my daughter needs health insurance more than I need to prove a point about independence. This isn't about proving anything, Clara said. It's about you trying to fix what you broke, Nate said bluntly. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's better than nothing. They talked for another 20 minutes about logistics and salary and health insurance details. Nate asked hard questions about reporting structure and job security, and what happened if this didn't work out. Clara answered honestly, admitting when she didn't know something, promising to find out. When they finally hung up, Clara sat in the dark of her apartment and wondered if she'd just made things better or worse. She wouldn't know until Nate showed up for his first day of work. Or didn't. Nate showed up on Monday morning at 9 a.m. sharp, wearing the same borrowed suit from the gala and carrying a backpack that had seen better days. Clara watched him through the glass walls of the conference room where Jennifer had set up their meeting, and her first thought was that he looked like a man walking toward either salvation or a firing squad and couldn't tell which. Jennifer noticed too. She leaned over to Clara and said quietly, "He looks terrified." "Wouldn't you be?" Clara stood up as Nate approached. This has to feel completely surreal for him. Nate entered the conference room with the careful posture of someone entering enemy territory. His eyes scanned the space, the mahogany table, the leather chairs, the view of the financial district spreading out below, and Clara saw him doing those calculations again, measuring the distance between his world and this one. "Morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Good morning," Clara replied, matching his tone. "Nate, you remember Jennifer from our phone calls. She's going to be your primary contact for most projects." Jennifer extended her hand and Nate shook it, his grip firm but brief. "Thanks for meeting with me," he said,
like this was a normal job interview instead of the most complicated employment arrangement Clara had ever witnessed. They sat, and for a moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched awkward and tense until Jennifer mercifully broke it. "So, I thought we'd start with an overview of what we're trying to accomplish here," she said, pulling up a presentation on her laptop. "Clara's vision is to shift how we evaluate and invest in residential properties, particularly in the affordable housing sector. That's where you come in." Nate listened as Jennifer walked through the current portfolio, the gaps in their analysis, the ways they'd been financing properties without truly understanding tenant experiences. He didn't interrupt, but Clara could see him processing, his jaw working slightly like he was chewing through thoughts that wanted to become words. When Jennifer finished, Nate said, "Can I be honest?" "Please," Clara said. "This sounds impossible." Nate leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "You're asking me to bridge two completely different worlds. Investment firms care about returns. Tenants care about heat and hot water, and not getting evicted. Those things don't naturally align." "That's exactly why we need you," Jennifer said, "because you understand both sides." "I understand the tenant side," Nate corrected. "I don't know anything about commercial real estate finance or investment analysis or whatever else you need to make this actually work." "You know what matters," Clara said. "That's more important than technical knowledge. Jennifer can teach you the finance parts, but we can't teach someone who's never struggled to understand what it's like to choose between medicine and rent." Nate looked at her directly for the first time since entering the room. "Is that what I am to you? A symbol of struggle? Someone who represents an experience you want to understand?" The question landed like a physical blow. Clara forced herself not to look away. "No," she said carefully. "You're someone who told me that money isn't a measure of worth. Choices are. And I'm trying to make better choices. That means listening to people whose perspectives I've ignored my whole life. And paying them for the privilege," Nate said. "And paying them what they're worth, yes." They stared at each other across the conference table, and Clara could feel Jennifer watching this exchange like a tennis match she couldn't quite follow. Finally, Nate said, "What's the salary?" Jennifer named a number that made Nate's eyes widen despite his attempt to stay impassive. It was triple what he'd been making at the warehouse, with full family health coverage that would actually cover Mia's cardiology appointments and medications. "That's..." Nate stopped, visibly composing himself. "That seems high for someone with no experience in this field." "It's market rate for a consultant position," Jennifer said. "And honestly, given what you bring to the table, it's fair." "What do I bring to the table?" Nate asked. "I'm a warehouse worker who got lucky with a rich woman's credit card." "You're a single father who's been navigating systems designed to crush people like you for 8 years and somehow kept your daughter alive and housed," Clara said. "You know how to evaluate what actually matters because you've lived with the consequences when things fall apart. That's not luck, Nate. That's expertise." Nate's expression shifted through several emotions Clara couldn't name. He looked down at his hands, then back up at Jennifer. "What's the trial period?" 6 months, Jennifer said. "Standard for new positions. But Nate, that's to protect you as much as us. If this doesn't feel right, you can walk away with no penalty and we'll provide references for your next opportunity. And if I can't do the work, if I'm not smart enough or educated enough or whatever enough to actually contribute, then we'll figure that out together," Clara said. "But I don't think that's going to be the problem." "What do you think the problem will be?" Nate asked. Clara considered lying, then decided he deserved honesty. "I think the problem will be that every day you come here, you'll be reminded that the reason you have this job is because I treated you like a game piece, and I think that's going to be hard to get past." Nate nodded slowly. "Yeah, it will be. Can you try anyway?" For a long moment, Nate didn't answer. Then, "My daughter needs health insurance. She needs stability. She needs a father who's not working himself to death just to keep the lights on. So yeah, I can try. But Clara," he paused. "Don't expect me to be grateful. Don't expect me to forget how this started. I'm taking this job because I need it, not because we're friends now." "I understand," Clara said, and she did. Understanding didn't make it hurt less, but she did understand. They spent the next 2 hours going through logistics. Jennifer explained the project pipeline, the properties they were currently evaluating, the kinds of assessments Nate would be doing. She set him up with a laptop and phone, explained the office layout, introduced him to other team members who looked at him with the polite curiosity reserved for people who didn't quite fit the usual corporate mold. Nate absorbed it all with the focused intensity of someone who knew this opportunity could evaporate if he didn't prove himself immediately. He took notes on everything, asked clarifying questions, and maintained a professional distance that felt both appropriate and heartbreaking. Around noon, Jennifer suggested they break for lunch. "There's a cafeteria downstairs or plenty of places nearby if you want to." "I brought something," Nate said, pulling a brown paper bag from his backpack. "I'll just eat at my desk." "You don't have to," Clara started, but Nate's expression stopped her. "I'm fine," he said. "Thank you." He left the conference room, and Clara watched him find the desk that would be his, pull out a sandwich wrapped in plastic wrap, and eat alone while reading through documents Jennifer had given him. Jennifer waited until he was out of earshot. "That went better than I expected." "Did it?" Clara felt exhausted despite it only being lunchtime. "He showed up. He's engaged. He's taking it seriously." Jennifer closed her laptop. "Clara, what did you expect, that he'd walk in here grateful and excited?" "No, Clara struggled for words. "I hoped it would feel less like I'm buying my way out of guilt." "Maybe you are," Jennifer said bluntly. "But you're also offering someone a genuine opportunity. Those two things can be true at the same time." Clara nodded but didn't feel convinced. She spent her lunch hour in her office, not eating, just staring at financial projections for the Talbot Avenue building and trying to calculate whether any of this actually helped or just made her feel better about being part of a broken system. The afternoon brought Nate's first real assignment. Jennifer took him to visit a property in Roxbury that the firm was considering for acquisition, a 4-story building that looked decent in photos but needed ground-level evaluation. "We usually just do financial analysis and inspector reports," Jennifer explained as they drove. "But Clara wants us to start assessing livability, what it's actually like to live there, not just whether it's up to code." Nate was quiet in the passenger seat, looking out at neighborhoods that probably felt more familiar than the financial district ever would. When they arrived at the building, he got out and just stood there for a moment, studying it with an intensity Clara recognized from the charity gala, that careful attention to detail that came from understanding consequences. The property manager met them outside, a woman in her 40s named Sandra, who clearly knew Jennifer from previous dealings. She unlocked the building and started the standard tour, pointing out recent renovations and updated appliances with the practiced enthusiasm of someone selling something. Nate followed silently, and Clara, who'd insisted on coming along despite Jennifer's suggestion that she stay at the office, watched him absorb everything. He ran his hand along the stairwell railing and it wobbled. He checked the hallway lighting and half the bulbs were out. He looked at the fire extinguisher and its inspection tag was 2 years expired. In the first apartment they toured, Nate walked straight to the windows and tried to open one. It stuck, painted shut. "That's a fire hazard," he said quietly. Sandra waved dismissively. "They've got the fire escape." "Have you checked the fire escape recently?" Nate walked to the window that led to it and peered out. "Because that looks like it's rusting through in places." Jennifer made a note. Sandra looked less enthusiastic. They toured 3 more units, and each time Nate found things that financial analysis wouldn't catch. Water pressure that was barely functional, outlets that sparked when you used them, a smell coming from under the kitchen sink that suggested plumbing problems hiding behind cosmetic fixes. In the last unit, Nate knelt down and opened the cabinet under the sink despite Sandra's protests. He pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and peered inside. "You've got black mold," he said, his voice flat. "Extensive. And the pipes are corroded. This whole building probably has the same problem, just hidden behind cheap renovations." Sandra started to argue, but Jennifer cut her off. "Nate, can you document this?" He spent the next 20 minutes photographing issues in every unit they could access, taking notes in a small notebook he'd brought from home. His documentation was meticulous. Measurements, descriptions, even sketches of pipe configurations that suggested larger systemic problems. When they finished, Sandra was hostile and Jennifer was impressed. They drove back to the office in silence until Jennifer said, "That was exactly what we needed." Nate shrugged. I just looked at what was there. Most people don't look, Clara said from the back seat. They see fresh paint and new countertops and assume everything's fine. Most people haven't lived with black mold, Nate replied, or tried to explain to their landlord why their kid's asthma keeps getting worse. The rest of Nate's first week followed a similar pattern. Jennifer would send him to properties, and he'd come back with assessments that were brutally honest and incredibly detailed. He evaluated buildings the way someone evaluated a used car they were planning to drive for a decade, looking for problems that would matter in real life, not just on paper. He also maintained careful distance from Clara. He was professional, respectful, and completely impersonal. If they ended up in the same meeting, he addressed her as Ms. Wren. If she tried to make conversation beyond work topics, he deflected with polite efficiency. By Thursday, Clara's father showed up at her office unannounced. Marcus Wren didn't believe in casual drop-ins, which meant this was serious. He sat in Clara's guest chair with the posture of a man who'd spent 40 years in boardrooms and knew exactly how to command a room through stillness. "I've been hearing interesting things about your new hire," he said without preamble. Clara kept her expression neutral. "Nate's doing excellent work." "Nate Harper, yes, the man from your charity event." Marcus studied her. "The one whose building you bought." "I see gossip travels fast." Jennifer reported the property acquisition to our finance team as required. They mentioned you'd hired someone with no relevant experience for a consultant position at a significant salary. Her father's voice was carefully empty of judgment, which somehow made it worse. "Clara, what are you doing?" "I'm trying to do things differently," Clara said. "Nate understands tenant experience in a way no one else on our team does. He's already identified issues that would have cost us significantly if we'd proceeded with that Roxbury acquisition." "I'm sure he's useful," Marcus said. "That's not what concerns me." "Then what does?" "The optics, the ethics, the fact that you're employing someone you have a personal connection to, someone who might feel obligated to you because of previous financial assistance." Marcus leaned forward. "Clara, this looks like either charity masquerading as employment, or worse, like you're using your position to maintain influence over someone vulnerable." The accusation hit harder because Clara had worried about the same thing. "Nate set the terms," she said. "He could have said no. He can quit any time." "Can he, though? You own his housing. You employ him. You've created a situation where his stability depends entirely on your goodwill." Her father's voice was gentle, which made it cut deeper. "I'm not saying you meant to do this, Clara. I'm saying you need to think about the power dynamics you've created." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "So what should I do? Fire him?" "That would just prove he was right to be suspicious in the first place." "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I think you need to ask yourself honestly whether you hired him because he's the best person for the job, or because hiring him makes you feel less guilty about how you met." After her father left, Clara sat in her office for a long time, staring at nothing. She wanted to believe she'd done the right thing, offered Nate an opportunity, created stability for his family, used her resources to actually help instead of just performing charity. But Marcus's words kept echoing. "You own his housing. You employ him. You've created a situation where his stability depends entirely on your goodwill." Clara pulled up Nate's employment file and looked at the salary, the benefits, the 6-month trial period. Then she looked at the ownership documents for Stable Ground Holdings and the lease for Unit 3A where Nate and Mia lived. Her father was right. She'd created a relationship where Nate's entire life depended on her decisions. If she got angry, she could fire him. If she decided the building wasn't worth maintaining, she could sell it. If she simply got bored with her social responsibility project, she could walk away and leave Nate exactly where he'd started. Except now he'd have lost his warehouse job and any illusion that effort mattered more than luck. She picked up her phone and called Jennifer. "I need you to do something," Clara said when Jennifer answered. "What's wrong?" "I need you to set up Nate's employment contract so that it's completely independent from anything else. If something happens to the building, his job is protected. If I decide to step back from the company, his position continues. I need firewalls." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "Your father talked to you?" "He pointed out some things I should have thought about before." "Clara, you're overthinking this. Nate's an adult. He made a choice." "Did he?" Clara asked. "Or did I back him into a corner where accepting was the only rational option?" "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Jennifer said. "Look, I'll set up the protections you want. But Clara, at some point you need to trust that Nate has agency in his own life. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in her expensive bed in her expensive apartment and thought about Nate 3 miles away, probably lying awake too, probably calculating new mathematics now that his variables had changed. Around 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and opened her laptop. She drafted an email to Nate, deleted it, drafted another one, deleted that too. Finally, she settled on something simple. Nate, I know this week has been a lot. I want you to know that your employment is not contingent on anything other than the quality of your work. Jennifer is setting up protections to ensure your job security is completely independent from building ownership or any other factors. You're not beholden to me. You're just an employee doing valuable work. I hope you can believe that. Clara. She sent it at 2:47 a.m. and immediately regretted it, but the damage was done. Nate's response came at 6:15 a.m. Received. Thank you for the clarification. Professional, polite, completely empty of anything real. Clara showed up at the office Friday morning to find Nate already at his desk, working through a property assessment with the focused intensity that seemed to be his default setting. He nodded when he saw her, a brief acknowledgement that held no warmth but no hostility either, just neutral, professional, distant. It was exactly what Clara had asked for, and it felt terrible. The morning passed in meetings and email chains and conference calls about properties Clara barely cared about anymore. Around 11 a.m., Jennifer knocked on her office door. Nate wants to talk to you, she said. He seems, I don't know, tense. Clara's stomach dropped. Did something happen? He won't say, just asked if you had time this afternoon. They met in the same conference room where Nate had started his first day. He sat across from Clara with his notebook open and his posture carefully controlled. I've been thinking about what you wrote in your email, he said without preamble, about protections and independence and me not being beholden to you. Okay, Clara said carefully, and I appreciate the intent, I do, but Clara, you can't protect me from the reality of this situation. Nate's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, not anger exactly, more like resignation. You own my building, you sign my paychecks, you're the reason my daughter has health insurance. Those are facts. You can't contract your way around them. I can try to make sure you're not vulnerable to... I'm already vulnerable, Nate interrupted. I've been vulnerable my whole life. The difference now is that my vulnerability depends on one person instead of a faceless system. I don't know if that's better or worse. Clara felt her chest tighten. What do you want me to do? I want you to stop trying to fix this, Nate said. You can't make it comfortable. You can't make it feel fair. It is what it is, a rich woman trying to help a poor man and creating a complicated mess in the process. That's not... Yes, it is, Nate said flatly. And maybe that's okay. Maybe complicated messes are better than the alternative, which was me and Mia getting evicted while I drowned in medical debt. But don't pretend this is clean. Don't pretend you can design the perfect ethical framework that makes everything okay. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside the conference room windows, the city continued its indifferent functioning, cars moving, people working, systems grinding along regardless of individual moral calculations. I'm sorry, Clara said finally. For what? For making this about my comfort instead of your reality. Nate nodded slowly. Okay, thank you for saying that. Is there anything I can actually do? Anything that would make this easier for you? Nate considered the question seriously. Pay me what I'm worth. Give me real work, not charity projects. Treat me like an employee, not a redemption arc. And when I mess up, because I will mess up, don't assume it's because I was never qualified in the first place. I can do that, Clara said. Can you? Nate looked at her directly. Because so far, every interaction we've had has been filtered through guilt or pity or whatever you're feeling about how we met. I need you to get past that if this is going to work. How do I do that? I don't know, Nate admitted, but figure it out because I can't do it for you. I'm too busy trying to figure out how to be good at a job I'm not sure I'm qualified for. You're qualified, Clara said. You don't know that. Neither do I. That's what the next 6 months are for. Nate stood up. I have a site visit in Mattapan this afternoon. Jennifer's driving. You coming? The question was casual, but Clara heard the test underneath it. Could she work with him? Could she see him as a colleague instead of a project? Yes, Clara said. I'm coming. The site visit in Mattapan was for a property that looked promising on paper, recently renovated, good occupancy rates, stable ownership. But when they arrived, Nate spent 5 minutes in the parking lot just watching. What are you looking for? Clara asked. Patterns, Nate said. Who's coming and going, what condition the cars are in, whether people look comfortable or tense. You can tell a lot about a building by watching it for a while. They watched. A woman came out with 2 kids, both wearing backpacks that looked new. An older man struggled down the steps with a walker, and nobody came to help him. A young couple argued by their car, their voices carrying across the parking lot with the specific exhaustion of people fighting about money. Okay, Nate said finally, let's look inside. The building manager was friendlier than Sandra had been, which made Clara immediately suspicious. Nate seemed to feel the same way, his questions sharper, his inspections more thorough. In the 3rd unit they toured, Nate opened a closet door and froze. What is it? Jennifer asked. Nate pulled out his phone and took several pictures before answering. You've got a major water intrusion problem. The wall is completely rotted through. You can see daylight through the gaps. The building manager started making excuses, but Nate cut her off with questions that revealed he'd seen this exact problem before, knew exactly what it meant, and understood the full scope of damage it suggested. By the time they left, Jennifer had a comprehensive list of issues that would have required hundreds of thousands in immediate repairs, none of which had been disclosed in the initial assessment. You just saved us from a terrible investment, Jennifer told Nate as they drove back. I just looked at what was there, Nate said again, but Clara could hear something different in his voice this time. Not pride exactly, but maybe the beginning of confidence. Back at the office, Clara watched Nate compile his findings into a report that was detailed, professional, and brutally honest. He worked with the focused intensity of someone who knew this might be his only chance to prove himself. Around 6 p.m., most of the office had cleared out. Clara was still at her desk when she noticed Nate packing up his backpack. On impulse, she walked over before she could talk herself out of it. Nate, he looked up, wary. Yeah? You did good work today. Really good work. Thanks. He zipped his backpack, preparing to leave. I mean it, Clara continued. You saw things we would have missed. You asked questions we wouldn't have known to ask. You were right. You do bring something valuable to this. Nate studied her for a long moment. You sound surprised. Maybe I am, Clara admitted. Not because I didn't think you were capable, because I'm realizing how much I didn't know about what capability actually looks like. Capability looks like survival, Nate said quietly. I've been looking at buildings with desperate eyes my whole life, trying to figure out if they'd kill me slowly or just make me miserable. That's not a skill you learn in school. No, Clara agreed. It's not. They stood there in the empty office, and for the first time since the charity gala, Clara felt like maybe they were having a real conversation instead of performing roles for each other. My daughter asked about my new job, Nate said suddenly. She wanted to know what I do now. What did you tell her? I told her I help people figure out if buildings are safe to live in. Nate's expression softened slightly. She said that sounded important, like I was helping people the way doctors helped her. Clara felt her throat close up. That's Nate. That's exactly what you're doing. Maybe, he said, or maybe I'm just a guy who got lucky with a rich woman's credit card and is trying not to mess up the second chance. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, Clara said, echoing what Jennifer had told her. Nate almost smiled. No, I guess they're not. He left after that, heading back to Dorchester and to Mia and to an apartment that was finally warm. Clara stayed at the office for another hour, not working, just thinking about everything that had led to this moment. She'd met Nate as entertainment. She'd helped him accidentally while trying to prove a point. She'd bought his building out of guilt and hired him out of some combination of conscience and confusion. And somehow, despite all of that, maybe they were building something that actually mattered. It wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. It was definitely complicated by power dynamics and history and the fundamental inequality that had brought them together in the first place. But Nate was right. Maybe complicated messes were better than the alternative. Clara's phone rang at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in early December, 3 weeks into Nate's employment. She almost didn't answer. Unknown number, late hour, probably spam, but something made her pick up. Clara? It was Nate, and his voice was wrong, tight, scared. I need help. Clara was on her feet immediately, heart hammering. What happened? Is it Mia? She's at Children's Hospital. Her heart. There were palpitations, irregular rhythm. They said, it's, His voice cracked. They're running tests now. I'm in the waiting room and they won't tell me anything and Clara, I don't know what to do. I'm coming, Clara said, already grabbing her keys. Which entrance? Emergency department, but you don't have to. I'm already leaving, 20 minutes. She made it in 15, parking illegally and running through the emergency entrance in sweatpants and a jacket she'd grabbed without thinking. The waiting room was fluorescent bright and full of worried parents and sick children, and it took her a moment to spot Nate. He was in the corner, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. He looked like he'd aged a decade since she'd seen him that afternoon at the office. Nate, Clara said, sitting beside him. He looked up, and the raw fear in his eyes made her chest hurt. They took her back an hour ago. They said the arrhythmia was significant, that they needed to stabilize her rhythm before they could do more tests. Okay, Clara said, trying to sound calm. That's good. They're treating it. Or it means she's dying and they don't want to tell me yet. Nate's hands were shaking. This is how it started last time. The irregular heartbeat, the emergency admission, and then Sarah. He stopped, unable to finish. Clara did something she'd never done before. She reached over and took his hand. He didn't pull away, just held on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become untethered. They sat like that for 20 minutes, not talking, just existing in the awful fluorescent limbo of hospital waiting rooms. Finally, a doctor emerged, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and tired shoulders. Mr. Harper? Nate stood so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. Is she... Mia's stable, the doctor said immediately, and Clara watched Nate's knees actually buckle with relief. We've got her rhythm under control with medication, but Mr. Harper, we need to talk about her long-term treatment plan. They followed the doctor to a small consultation room. Clara started to wait outside, but Nate said stay, so quietly she almost missed it, and she followed them in. The doctor, Dr. Reyes, according to her badge, pulled up Mia's charts on a computer screen. Mia's condition has been managed well considering the circumstances, but the arrhythmias are becoming more frequent. She's going to need a procedure, an ablation to correct the electrical pathways in her heart. How soon? Nate asked. Ideally within the next few months. It's not immediately life-threatening, but each episode puts strain on her heart. The longer we wait, the more damage accumulates. And the cost? Dr. Reyes's expression shifted to something Clara recognized, the specific discomfort of medical professionals who had to discuss money with terrified parents. The procedure itself runs around $75,000. With your new insurance through, she checked the file, Wren Investments, you'll have coverage for 80% after the deductible. Clara watched Nate do the math. Even with insurance, he'd be looking at $15,000 to $20,000 out of pocket. Money he didn't have. Money that would bury him again just when he'd started to breathe. Can I see her? Nate asked, his voice carefully controlled. Of course. She's asking for you, doctor. Reyes led them to a pediatric room where Mia lay in a bed that made her look impossibly small. She was awake, monitors beeping softly beside her, an IV in her small hand. When she saw Nate, her face crumpled. Daddy, I was so scared. I know, baby. I know. Nate sat on the edge of her bed and gathered her into his arms as carefully as if she were made of glass. But you're okay now. You're safe. Clara stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder on something private and sacred. She started to back out, but Mia noticed her. Who's that? She asked, her voice small. That's Clara, Nate said after a pause. She's a friend from work.
Mia studied Clara with solemn eyes that seemed too knowing for 8 years old. "You're pretty." "Thank you," Clara said, her throat tight. "You're very brave." "I don't feel brave," Mia whispered. "I feel scared." "Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave," Clara said. "Sometimes brave just means keeping going even when you're terrified."
Mia seemed to consider this, then nodded and turned back to her father. Clara slipped out into the hallway and found Dr. Reyes waiting. "She's his whole world," the doctor said quietly. "I've been Mia's cardiologist for 3 years now. I've watched him move heaven and earth to keep her healthy." "I know," Clara said. "Then you know that $20,000 might as well be $2 million to someone in his position." Dr. Reyes looked at Clara directly. "The hospital has charity programs, payment plans, but they take time to process, and Mia needs this procedure soon." Clara understood what the doctor was really saying. She pulled out her phone. "What's the hospital's billing department contact?" 20 minutes later, Clara had arranged to cover Mia's portion of the procedure costs directly. Not as charity, she'd learned that lesson. As an advance on Nate's salary, structured as a zero-interest loan he could pay back over 5 years. Or not. She'd forgive it eventually, but she'd learned that Nate needed the fiction of repayment to accept help. When she went back to Mia's room, Nate was reading to his daughter from a book someone had brought from the hospital's collection. His voice was soft and steady, and Mia's eyes were starting to drift closed. Clara waited until she was asleep before speaking. "Can we talk outside?" They stepped into the hallway, and Clara explained what she'd arranged. She watched Nate's face go through a complicated sequence of emotions: relief, frustration, resignation, something that might have been gratitude or might have been exhaustion. "You can't keep doing this," he said finally. "Doing what?" "Solving my problems with money." "I'm not solving your problems," Clara said. "I'm removing one obstacle so you can focus on what matters. Mia needs the procedure. You need to be present for her, not drowning in financial panic. This lets you do that, at the cost of owing you even more." "Nate?" Clara stopped, choosing her words carefully. "I have more money than I'll ever need. You have a daughter who needs medical care. Those are both facts. I can either use my money to help, or I can protect my ego by pretending financial help is somehow morally complicated. But it's not complicated. Mia needs surgery. I can make that happen without it hurting either of you. That's not charity. That's just basic human decency." Nate leaned against the wall, looking more exhausted than Clara had ever seen him. "I hate this. I know. I hate needing help. I hate that my daughter's life depends on your generosity. I hate that I can't provide for her on my own." "You are providing for her," Clara said. "You got her here tonight. You've kept her alive for 8 years against impossible odds. You're doing everything right, Nate. The system is what's wrong." "Doesn't make me feel less like a failure." Clara wanted to argue, to tell him he wasn't a failure, to list all the ways he was succeeding against a rigged game, but she was learning that sometimes people needed to sit with their feelings instead of having them fixed. "Okay," she said simply. "You can feel like a failure, and I can still pay for the surgery. Both things can be true." Nate almost laughed, a broken sound. "You're learning." "I'm trying." They stood in the hallway outside Mia's room, and something shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, the power dynamics were too complicated for that, but maybe something like mutual respect, an acknowledgement that they were both trying to navigate an impossible situation with imperfect tools. "Thank you," Nate said quietly. "I know I'm supposed to be angry about this, and maybe I will be tomorrow, but right now, I'm just... Thank you." "You're welcome," Clara said. Then, "I'm going to head out, but call me if anything changes." "I will." Clara left the hospital and drove home through streets that looked different than they had an hour ago. She kept thinking about Mia's small face, about the monitors beeping beside her bed, about Nate's hands shaking in the waiting room. This was what money meant when you removed it from abstractions, not investments or returns or portfolio diversification. Just an 8-year-old girl who got to have heart surgery instead of wondering if her father could afford to keep her alive. Clara couldn't fix the system that made that a question anyone had to ask. But she could fix it for one family, and maybe that was enough. Over the next 2 weeks, Mia stayed in the hospital for monitoring while they prepared for her procedure. Nate took family leave, a benefit Clara had quietly insisted on including in everyone's employment contracts, and spent every day at Children's Hospital. Clara visited twice, bringing books for Mia and coffee for Nate, staying just long enough to feel like she was helping without intruding. Mia's surgery was scheduled for December 18th. The night before, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about all the ways things could go wrong, about Nate's wife dying during a similar procedure, about what would happen to Nate if he lost his daughter, too. She was still awake at 6 a.m. when her phone buzzed with a text from Nate. "Surgery's at 9. You don't have to come, but if you wanted to." Clara was at the hospital by 8:30. She found Nate in the pre-op waiting area, looking like he'd been awake for 72 straight hours. Mia was in a hospital gown, small and scared but trying to be brave. "Hi, Clara," Mia said when she saw her. "Daddy said you might come." "I wanted to wish you luck," Clara said, sitting beside the bed. "You're going to do great." "What if I don't?" Mia's voice was small. "What if something goes wrong like it did with my mom?" Clara looked at Nate, saw the pain flash across his face. She took Mia's hand carefully, mindful of the IV. "Your mom loved you very much," Clara said, "and she'd want you to be brave today. Not fearless, that's different. Just brave enough to trust the doctors and get through this." "How do you know what my mom would want?" Mia asked, not hostile, just genuinely curious. "Because every mom wants their kid to be safe and healthy," Clara said. "That's universal." A nurse came to take Mia back to the operating room. Nate held his daughter close for a long moment, whispering something Clara couldn't hear. Then they wheeled her away, and Nate and Clara were left in the waiting room with nothing to do but wait. The surgery was supposed to take 3 hours. It took 4, then 5. By hour 6, Nate was pacing like a caged animal, and Clara was running through every worst-case scenario her mind could generate. She'd called Jennifer to cancel all her meetings. She'd texted her father that she wouldn't be available today. None of it mattered compared to the small girl in an operating room whose life hung in the balance. Finally, at 3:47 p.m., Dr. Reyes emerged. Her scrubs were wrinkled and she looked tired, but she was smiling. "The procedure went well," she said, and Nate actually sobbed with relief. "We corrected the arrhythmia, and her heart responded beautifully. She's in recovery now, and you can see her in about an hour." "She's okay?" Nate asked, like he needed to hear it again. "She's okay," Dr. Reyes confirmed. "She'll need monitoring for a few days, but Mr. Harper, Nate, I think this is going to change her life. No more constant worry about her heart rhythm, no more restrictions on activity. She gets to be a normal 8-year-old. Nate sat down hard in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands. Clara sat beside him and didn't say anything, just let him process the relief that was probably mixed with grief for his wife who hadn't survived her own surgery, and fear that had been living in his body for 8 years, and exhaustion from carrying all of it alone for so long. When they finally let Nate see Mia, Clara stayed in the waiting room. This moment was theirs, not hers. She'd done what she could, removed the financial barrier, showed up, witnessed. The rest belonged to a father and daughter who'd survived something that should have broken them. Clara was getting coffee from the cafeteria when Nate found her an hour later. "She wants to see you," he said. "She doesn't have to." "She asked," Nate said. "Come on." Mia was awake and hooked up to monitors, but she looked more alert than Clara had ever seen her. Color in her cheeks, light in her eyes. "The doctor says my heart works right now," Mia announced when Clara entered. "Like, really right. Not just okay for me, but actually right." "That's amazing," Clara said, her throat tight. "Daddy said you helped make it happen." Mia looked at Clara seriously. "Did you?" Clara glanced at Nate, who nodded slightly. "I helped with the money part," Clara said carefully. "But your dad is the one who kept you safe all these years. He's the real hero." "He says you're a hero too," Mia said. "He says you helped us when we needed it most." Clara felt tears starting and blinked them back. "I'm glad I could help." They stayed for another 20 minutes until Mia started to tire. On the way out, Nate stopped Clara in the hallway. "I've been thinking," he said, "about everything. The building, the job, the surgery money.
All of it. Clara braced herself for resignation, for Nate to tell her this was too much, too complicated, that he needed to walk away and figure out his own path. Instead, he said, I want to make this work. Not just endure it or accept it because I don't have other options. Actually make it work. The job, the professional relationship, all of it. But I need you to meet me halfway. What does that mean? It means stop treating me like a charity case, Nate said bluntly. Stop assuming I need protection or special handling. Give me real work, real responsibility, real expectations. And when I inevitably mess up, treat me like you'd treat any employee, with feedback and standards, not pity. I can do that, Clara said. Can you, though? Nate's expression was serious. Because every time something hard happens, your instinct is to throw money at it. And I get why. Money solves a lot of problems when you have it, but it doesn't solve everything. Sometimes people just need to be seen as competent adults instead of problems to be fixed. Clara absorbed this. You're right. I have been doing that. So stop, Nate said. I'm not asking you to stop helping when help is needed. I'm asking you to trust that I can tell the difference between needing help and needing space. How do I know which is which? Ask me, Nate said simply. Novel concept, I know. Clara almost laughed. Okay, I can do that. They stood in the hospital hallway, and Clara felt something settle that had been unsettled since the charity gala. Not resolution exactly. This was too complicated for neat resolution, but maybe the beginning of something sustainable. I should get back to Mia, Nate said. But Clara, thank you for everything, even the complicated parts. You're welcome, Clara said, even for the complicated parts. The next 3 months proved Nate's point in ways Clara hadn't expected. He messed up, missed a critical detail in a property assessment that Jennifer caught, submitted a report with recommendations that were emotionally sound but financially impossible. Each time, Clara's instinct was to excuse it, to lower standards, to make accommodations. Each time, Nate called her on it. I screwed up, he'd say. Tell me how to do better instead of pretending it's fine. So Clara learned to give real feedback, to have difficult conversations about professional standards, to treat Nate like she'd treat any consultant who brought valuable perspective but needed to develop new skills. And Nate rose to meet those standards. By March, his property assessments were so thorough that Jennifer started bringing him to acquisition meetings with the firm's senior partners. By April, he'd developed a framework for evaluating livability that the entire real estate division started using. By May, he was training new analysts on tenant-focused assessment methods. The building on Talbot Avenue transformed too. Patricia brought in tenants for input on renovations. Marcus, the superintendent, organized a tenant association. Clara approved budgets for improvements that went beyond basic functionality. A community garden, a children's play area, security cameras that actually worked. The building still lost money every month. Clara didn't care. What mattered was that Mrs. Chen's apartment stayed warm all winter, that the young couple who'd been arguing in the parking lot got connected with financial counseling services Patricia had researched, that a single mother in 2B didn't have to choose between fixing her car and paying rent because Patricia worked with her on a payment plan that actually made sense. What mattered was that Nate and Mia lived in a building where stability wasn't a luxury, it was a baseline expectation. Mia's recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. By spring, she was running around the playground at school like any other kid. Her cardiologist visits became routine checkups instead of crisis management. She joined a soccer team, something that would have been impossible before the surgery, and Nate's calendar filled with weekend games instead of medical appointments. Claire went to one of those games in early June, sitting in the stands with other parents while 8-year-olds chased a ball with more enthusiasm than skill. Mia was small for her age, but fearless, throwing herself into the game with the intensity of someone who'd been told she couldn't for too long. Nate sat beside Clara, cheering every time Mia touched the ball. She's really good, Clara said. She's terrible, Nate replied, grinning. Doesn't matter, she's playing. That's what matters. After the game, a decisive loss that no one seemed to care about, Mia ran over, grass-stained and glowing. Did you see? Did you see me almost score? I saw, Nate said. You were amazing. Mia turned to Clara.
Are you coming to our end-of-season party? All the parents come and there's pizza? Clara looked at Nate, unsure. He shrugged. Permission or challenge, she couldn't tell which. I'd love to, Clara said. The party was at a local pizza place, crowded and loud and completely overwhelming. Clara found herself sitting between Nate and another parent, eating cheap pizza and listening to 8-year-olds talk over each other about soccer and school and summer plans. It was possibly the most normal thing she'd done in years. Afterward, as the party was winding down, Nate walked Clara to her car. Thank you for coming, he said. Thank you for inviting me. I didn't, Nate pointed out. Mia did. Thank you for not uninviting me then. Nate smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. You're growing on her. She talks about you sometimes. The lady from Daddy's work who helped us. How does she understand all of this? Clara asked. The building, the job, the surgery money? I told her the truth, Nate said. That sometimes people help each other, and sometimes the help is complicated, but that doesn't make it less real. That's a good answer. She's a smart kid. She can handle complicated. They stood by Clara's car in the parking lot of a cheap pizza place, and Clara thought about how far they'd come from the charity gala. How much had changed, and how much was still changing. I have something to tell you, Nate said. My 6-month trial period ends next week. Clara's stomach dropped. Are you leaving? No, Nate said. I'm asking to make this permanent. Not because I don't have other options. Jennifer's been getting me calls from other firms. But because this work matters, and I'm good at it, and I want to keep doing it. Of course, Clara said immediately. Nate, you've been permanent in my mind since month 2. I needed to know it was my choice, Nate said. That I was staying because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated. And now you know? Now I know, Nate confirmed. I'm choosing this. The job, the professional relationship, all of it. On my terms. Clara felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Okay, good. That's really good. There's one more thing, Nate said. I want to buy my apartment. What? Unit 3A. I want to buy it. Fair market value, proper mortgage, all of it legal and clean. Nate's expression was serious. I can't keep living in a building you own. It's too complicated. But I also can't afford to move and I don't want to uproot Mia. So I want to buy my unit and own my own space. Clara's first instinct was to just give him the apartment. Her second instinct was to offer it at a massive discount. Her third instinct was to remember what Nate had said about being treated like a competent adult. Okay, she said. Let's work out the details. Fair market value, standard mortgage terms. I'll have Patricia connect you with the bank we use for purchases. Nate nodded, satisfied. Thank you. You're really doing this, Clara said, taking control of everything. I'm trying, Nate said. You showed me what financial stability could look like, but I need to build my own version of it, not just live in yours. They said goodbye, and Clara drove home thinking about how easy it would have been to just keep solving Nate's problems with money. How much harder it was to step back and let him solve them himself, even when she could make things easier. But Nate was right. He needed to build his own stability, make his own choices, own his own life. Literally, in the case of the apartment. Clara could give him opportunities. She couldn't give him dignity. That he had to claim for himself. The apartment purchase went through in August. Nate became the owner of Unit 3A with a mortgage he could actually afford on his consultant salary and a sense of permanence he'd never had before. Clara sold him the unit at market value. No discounts, no special deals, and Nate signed the papers with visible satisfaction. How does it feel? Clara asked after the closing. Like I finally own something that can't be taken away, Nate said. Like Mia and I have a foundation that's ours. By September, Nate had been with the firm for 9 months. His work had influenced 3 major investment decisions, saved them from 2 terrible acquisitions, and created a framework that was starting to shift how the entire company thought about property value. Clara's father called her into his office one afternoon, and she prepared herself for criticism or concern or one of Marcus Wren's careful interventions. Instead, he said, "Your affordable housing initiative is getting attention. Good attention. We've had inquiries from other firms wanting to know about our assessment methods. That's Nate's work. Clara said immediately. I know, Marcus said, which is why I want to expand it. Create a full division focused on responsible property investment with proper funding and staff. I'd want you and Nate to head it up. Clara stared at her father. You're serious? Completely. You've proven there's value in doing this differently. Now, let's scale it. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Clara, I'll be honest. I wasn't sure about any of this when you started. The building purchase, hiring Nate, all of it seemed potentially problematic. But you've built something real, something that actually works. It's still complicated, Clara said. The best things usually are, her father replied. So what do you say? Want to turn your experiment into something permanent? Clara met with Nate that afternoon to discuss the proposal. They sat in a conference room that had become familiar territory, and Clara laid out her father's offer. It would mean more responsibility, she said, bigger projects, actual staff to manage, company-wide influence. But Nate, it would also mean we're not just fixing one building. We'd be trying to change how investment firms think about housing entirely. Nate was quiet for a long moment. That's ambitious. Too ambitious? Maybe, Nate admitted, but I spent 8 years thinking the system was immovable. And then you moved a piece of it, so maybe ambitious is exactly what we need. Is that a yes? That's a, let me think about it, Nate said. This is a big decision, and I need to make sure it's right for me and for Mia. Can I have a few days? Take as long as you need, Clara said. Nate came back 3 days later with a list of conditions. He wanted clear reporting structures that didn't create conflicts of interest. He wanted input on hiring decisions. He wanted assurance that his lack of traditional credentials wouldn't limit his authority or influence. Most importantly, he wanted the division's mission statement to explicitly include tenant advocacy alongside financial returns. Clara agreed to all of it. The division launched in October with a staff of 5, including Nate as co-director and Jennifer as financial lead. Their first project was acquiring 3 buildings in Roxbury with plans to renovate while keeping rents affordable. Their second was developing a training program to teach other property managers tenant-focused maintenance practices. It was ambitious. It was complicated. It was probably going to lose money for years. Clara had never been more certain of anything in her life. On a cold evening in November, almost exactly a year after the charity gala, Clara found herself back at the Boston Harbor Hotel for another fundraising event. Same ballroom, same champagne fountains, same people in expensive clothes talking about charity like it was a spectator sport. But this time, Nate was with her. Not as entertainment or a project, but as a colleague attending a professional event. They stood near the entrance, and Clara watched Nate survey the room with the same careful attention he'd had a year ago. Except now he was wearing a suit he'd bought himself, carrying business cards with his actual title, standing beside her as an equal instead of a curiosity. Strange being back here, Nate said quietly. Yeah, Clara agreed. A lot has changed. Has it, though? Nate gestured toward the crowd. Same people, same assumptions. They look at me and still see someone who doesn't belong. Do you care? Nate considered this. Less than I used to. I know what I'm worth now, not because you told me, but because I proved it to myself. Clara smiled. That was always the point. Was it? Nate looked at her. I thought the point was you feeling less guilty about privilege. Maybe it started that way, Clara admitted, but it became about building something that actually matters, and I couldn't have done that without you showing me what matters actually looks like. They were interrupted by someone from the fundraising committee asking Clara about a donation, and the moment passed. But as Clara wrote a check, a large one, for pediatric cardiology research, she caught Nate watching her with something that might have been approval. Later, as the event was winding down, they stood outside in the November cold, almost exactly where they'd stood a year ago, except everything was different. My daughter talks about you sometimes, Nate said. She says you're the reason she got to play soccer this year. That's not... Clara started, then stopped. Okay, maybe a little, but Nate, you're the reason she survived long enough to play soccer. Don't forget that. I'm trying not to, Nate said. It's hard, remembering that I'm capable when I spent so long feeling powerless. You were never powerless, Clara said. The system was just rigged against you. There's a difference. Maybe, Nate said. Then, thank you for all of it, even the parts that were messy and complicated and probably questionable. Especially those parts, Clara said. They taught me more than anything else. Nate smiled, and it was genuine and warm and completely without the guardedness that had defined their early interactions. So what now? Now we keep building, Clara said. More properties, better systems, proving that it's possible to invest in housing without treating people like profit generators. That's going to take a while. Good thing we're not going anywhere, Clara said. They stood in the November cold, and Clara thought about everything that had led to this moment. A cruel game at a charity gala. A desperate father taking money because his daughter's life mattered more than his pride. An accidental collision between privilege and survival that had somehow become something real. It wasn't a clean story. It wasn't simple or easy or free of complications. The power dynamic still existed. The history still mattered. The fundamental inequality that had brought them together was still the water they all swam in. But they were building something anyway. Not perfect, but better. Not a solution to systemic problems, but a functional model that proved those problems didn't have to be permanent. Nate owned his apartment now. Mia's heart worked properly. The building on Talbot Avenue had heat and hot water and a superintendent who actually fixed things. 17 other families lived in stable housing with rents they could afford. It was a small dent in a massive problem, but it was real, and it mattered, and it existed because Clara had been willing to be uncomfortable and Nate had been willing to take a risk. I should get home, Nate said. Mrs. Chen is watching Mia, and I promised I'd be back by 10. Tell Mia I said hi, Claire said. She wants to know if you're coming to her next soccer game, Nate said. Season starts in spring. I'll be there, Clara promised. Nate nodded, started to leave, then turned back. Hey, Clara? Yeah? Money isn't a measure of worth. Choices are. He paused. You made good choices, even when they were complicated, especially when they were complicated. So did you, Clara said. Taking that card, accepting the job, buying your apartment, all of it took courage. Or desperation, Nate said with a slight smile. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Nate laughed, a real laugh, and Clara felt something settle that had been unsettled for a year. Not resolution. This would always be complicated, but peace with the complexity. They said goodbye, and Nate walked toward the subway station while Clara headed to her car. Different directions, different lives, but connected now by something more substantial than charity or guilt. Connected by the hard work of building something better in a broken world. Clara drove home through streets she understood differently now, past buildings where people lived lives she'd learned to see instead of ignore. She thought about Mia playing soccer in the spring, about the new properties they'd be evaluating next week, about all the ways the world was still terrible and broken and unfair, and about the small ways it was possible to make it less so, one decision at a time, one person at a time, one building at a time. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And sometimes Clara had learned something was exactly what survival looked like for everyone involved.